Our journey takes us to the 11th century North Sea, beneath Cnut's rule. In 1016, in Essex, the army of King Edmund Ironside met Cnut's Danish forces after months of campaigning. Within 6 weeks, Edmund was dead, and Cnut was preparing to rule all England from a throne won beside the North Sea. At the English coast, near Sandwich, in the autumn of 1015, you stand beneath a low grey sky as Cnut's Danish fleet approaches across the North Sea. The ships come quietly at first, their dark hulls rising and falling beyond the pale line of breakers. Oar blades dip together, disappear beneath the cold water, and return shining. Wet wool clings to shoulders. Tarred rope lies coiled beside the masts, black and glossy with salt. Along the nearest gunwale, shield rims knock softly against the wood whenever the sea lifts the vessel. Smoke from a shore settlement drifts inland, carrying the faint scent of burning brush and damp earth. You feel the autumn wind move across your face, steady and cool, while the fleet gathers beneath the open sky. Cnut stands among the warriors near the foremost mast, a young prince whose future is still uncertain. He was probably born around 995, although no exact birth date has survived, and the years ahead have not yet settled into any clear shape. He is the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark and briefly King of England, a ruler whose ambition has already carried Danish power deep into the island kingdom. Behind Cnut stretches the memory of Sweyn's conquest. In 1013, Sweyn conquered England, forcing King Ethelred Roman II into exile in Normandy and receiving the submission of much of the country. Yet the victory did not last. Sweyn died at Gainsborough in February 1014, and the throne he had taken passed at once into uncertainty. As the fleet moves nearer to the beach, dark figures wait beside beach boats and rough timber shelters. Gulls turn above the shallows. The sand is marked by wheel tracks, hoofprints, and narrow grooves left by dragging vessels beyond the reach of the tide. Smoke hangs low over the settlement, softening the outlines of fences and sheds. Beneath your feet, the ground feels damp and yielding. You hear leather creak, metal shift, and harness rings strike together with small, restrained sounds. The sea keeps its patient rhythm. Water touches the hulls. Oars rise and fall. The shore receives the fleet without ceremony. After Sweyn's death, the English recalled Ethelred Roman II from exile in Normandy, preferring the familiar West Saxon king to the uncertain rule of a Danish prince. Ethelred returned in 1014, and Cnut withdrew to Denmark after his restoration. For a time, the young prince left England with the knowledge that conquest could be undone by death, memory, and the loyalties of English nobles. The kingdom remained divided beneath its surface. Danish settlers and rulers held much of the north and east through the territory already known as the Danelaw. Wessex preserved the older West Saxon tradition, while London guarded the river crossing and the political heart of the south. England was not one simple kingdom waiting for a single master. It was a land of overlapping allegiances, old rivalries, and roads that followed rivers more faithfully than boundaries. By now, the beach grows crowded as the first ships enter the shallows. Horses shift their weight beneath coverings darkened by spray. Men brace themselves against the sides of the vessels, preparing to guide the animals down wooden ramps. The smell of salt gives way to wet leather, manure, smoke, and churned sand. A rope tightens with a low groan. Someone calls softly across the water, and the answering voice seems almost lost beneath the wind. You notice the texture of the shields, some painted brightly, others dulled by travel and rain. Their rounded rims rest against the gunwales like sleeping forms. Beyond them, the grey sea continues towards Denmark, while the English shore lies close and silent beneath its autumn cloud. In 1015, Cnut sailed for England with a large Danish army. His invasion formed part of a longer Scandinavian struggle for control of England, in which kingship moved through marriages, oaths, raids, and sudden deaths. The army did not arrive to find an untouched country. It entered a political landscape shaped by the Danelaw, by memories of Sweyn's brief rule, and by the continuing authority of Ethelred Roman II. Several English nobles supported Cnut, seeing in him a powerful claimant with Danish resources behind him. Others remained loyal to Edmund, Ethelred's son, whose courage and local connections gave the West Saxon cause a living centre. Around you, the Danish landing becomes a movement of preparation. Horses leave the ships. Weapons are carried inland. The invasion begins as a series of practical tasks. The fleet does not vanish when the army reaches the shore. It remains close, drawn up where the tide can lift the hulls again, its presence binding the campaign to the sea. Cnut's strength lies partly in this mobility. His ships can move along the eastern coast, carry messages and supplies, and enter the Thames when the river allows. The English roads are slow beneath rain, and carts sink into mud, but vessels can pass swiftly between settlements. In the distance, the water darkens beneath the afternoon cloud. All blades are rinsed and stacked. Tar warms faintly in the wind. You hear hammering from the shore, where men repair a damaged thwart and fasten a loose plank. The army prepares to travel while the fleet waits like a second road. Cnut's advance carries him through a kingdom already divided between Danish and West Saxon power. The Danish army operates around the Thames and across southern and eastern England, moving where food, roads, rivers, and local agreements permit. The campaign is not one clean march towards a single battle. It is a patient contest of movement. Settlements are threatened. Garrisons are tested. Supplies are gathered or destroyed. Nobles decide which banners to follow, sometimes from conviction and sometimes from the simple need to protect their lands. Cnut must keep his army fed and his ships connected to the campaign. Edmund must preserve the loyalty of Wessex while resisting a force that can appear on one bank of a river and disappear along another. The banks of the Thames are soft with mud, and every step leaves a dark impression. Reeds lean together beside quiet channels. Fallen leaves gather against roots and half-submerged branches. Smoke from distant houses lies close to the water, its smell mixed with wet grass and rotting timber. Somewhere beyond the mist, a boatman poles through a narrow creek. The pole touches the riverbed, slides free, and touches again. You hear the muffled creak of leather harness and the slow breathing of horses waiting beside the bank. Danish ships rest in deeper water, their masts reflected as broken lines. Along the shore, men carry provisions through the mud, while the river moves steadily towards London. The pressure upon London grows during the spring and summer of 1016. The city resists Cnut's attempts to force a final decision, protected by its walls, its river position, and the determination of those who remain loyal to Edmund. Cnut's army approaches, withdraws, and returns. The Danish fleet benefits from naval mobility along the Thames, but the river does not yield the city easily. Banks must be surveyed, ditches must be crossed, timber must be hauled through wet ground. At times, Cnut's men attempt to alter waterways or prepare approaches towards the walls. London remains a place of resistance, and every delay costs the Danish army time, supplies, and strength. Yet delay also burdens the defenders, who must maintain the city while the countryside around them is contested. Under the morning cloud, London rises from the river in muted colours. The walls appear brown and grey, darkened by rain. Wooden platforms stand above the water, and ropes stretch from boats to muddy steps. The Thames carries reeds, fragments of bark, and pale foam beneath the city's shadow. On the riverbank, footprints overlap until the mud becomes a single uneven surface. You smell damp earth, smoke, fish, and the sharp odour of wet wool. From within the walls comes the occasional strike of a hammer, followed by the distant murmur of voices. The ships remain below, rocking gently against their moorings. Their ropes creak. Water taps against the hulls. London waits behind its defences. While Cnut presses against London, Edmund works to recover the strength of Wessex. After Ethelred Roman II died in April 1016 during Cnut's campaign, Edmund succeeded him as king with support from London. Edmund became known as Ironside, probably because of his reputation for military resistance, and the name suited the hard shape of the struggle before him. He was not merely defending an inheritance. He was gathering a kingdom whose loyalties had begun to separate under the pressure of invasion. Edmund fought to defend Wessex against Danish control during the campaign of 1016, providing a base from which he could challenge Cnut's movements. The conflict now placed two rival kings at the center of a divided English kingdom. Rain darkens the fields of Wessex, where hedges hold beads of water and paths turn to brown paste beneath marching feet. The air smells of soaked leaves, horse sweat, and distant wood smoke. Men move along narrow ridges between fields, their shields wrapped in cloth against the weather. Spears rise above them like thin branches. At farmsteads beside the road, doors remain closed while small fires burn behind gaps in the shutters. You hear boots drawing free from the mud with a slow, heavy sound. Hooves strike harder ground near the ditches. Far away, a bell sounds once, then becomes indistinct in the mist. Wessex is not silent. It is listening, measuring, and choosing. Edmund's recovery of Wessex gives the English cause renewed weight, but it does not end the campaign. The war consists of repeated movements, sieges, raids, and field engagements rather than one immediate decision. Cnut's army can threaten a town, withdraw towards the river, and return by ship to another district. Edmund can raise forces in Wessex, march north or east, and attempt to cut Danish communications. Each side seeks the moment when the other is tired, divided, or short of food. The campaign becomes a contest of stamina, supply, local allegiance, and river access. Cnut's battlefield strength matters, but so do the carts behind his lines, the boats on the Thames, and the English nobles who decide whether to open a gate or close it. At a river landing, provisions lie beneath oiled cloth. Barrels of grain rest beside bundles of arrows, sacks of salt, and coils of spare cordage. The wind carries the scent of tarred rope and smoke from shore settlements. Water laps at the bank with a small, repeated hush. A horse lowers its head towards the reeds, while a handler strokes its wet neck and murmurs without words. Shield rims knock gently against the wooden gunwales. You feel dampness rising from the riverbank into your boots. Beyond the landing, the country stretches in low folds, green beneath a colorless sky. Nothing appears hurried. Even the army's preparations seem governed by tide, weather, and patience. Several English nobles support Cnut as the months pass, while others remain loyal to Edmund. Their decisions are shaped by family ties, local rivalries, fear, ambition, and practical judgment. A nobleman who has lost a hall to one army may welcome the other. A lord whose lands lie near a Danish garrison may offer submission simply to preserve them. Another may remember the authority of Wessex and hold fast to Edmund's cause. These choices alter the campaign as surely as a clash of shield walls. A bridge can be guarded or abandoned. A storehouse can be opened or emptied. A messenger can cross safely or disappear among the lanes. Cnut's invasion is therefore a military movement and a political negotiation, conducted across fields, rivers, halls, and fortified towns. The countryside around the Thames settles beneath an evening of low cloud. Wet reeds brush against one another with a dry whisper, and the river turns from silver to dark pewter. Fires appear one by one along the banks, their reflections trembling in the current. Smoke gathers beneath the trees, carrying the scent of ash and damp bark. You hear a distant oar enter the water, followed by another and then another, each stroke placed carefully in the silence. On the shore, a man folds a cloak across a sleeping companion. Nearby, a spear rests against a wagon wheel. The air feels cold against your hands. The river keeps moving while armies wait. London's resistance continues through the spring and summer of 1016. and the city becomes the fixed point around which much of the conflict turns. Cnut cannot ignore it, because control of London would strengthen his claim and secure the Thames. Edmund cannot surrender it, because the city offers wealth, prestige, and access to the central routes of England. The Danish army attempts pressure from land and water, but the defenders use the city's walls and the river's changing conditions to delay him. The effort consumes men and materials. Siege works must be built, dismantled, and built again. Ships must be hauled through mud. Food must be carried from distant districts. Each side watches the other for signs of weakness, while the season moves gradually towards autumn. At dawn, the riverbank is covered in a thin veil of mist. The walls of London emerge slowly, first as a darker line, then as a mass of timber, earth, and stone. Water beads along the ropes of the moored ships. The decks are slick beneath bare feet. A folded sail hangs heavy and pale from its yard. You smell wet canvas, cold ash, and the faint sweetness of crushed reeds. A crow calls from somewhere beyond the ditch. No answer follows. The tide moves against the bank, lifting small branches and turning them in slow circles. Near the ships, shield rims touch the gunwales whenever the hulls drift together. The sound is soft enough to belong to the river. Cnut's army benefits from the Thames and the eastern coast, using naval mobility to preserve contact between separated forces and bring provisions towards threatened positions. Ships carry men across distances that would be difficult by road, especially where rain has swollen streams and damaged bridges. They allow Cnut to choose between several approaches, retreat without abandoning his supplies, and appear where Edmund's army does not expect him. Yet the fleet cannot solve every difficulty. Wind may oppose it, tides may delay it. The river may become too shallow for a heavy vessel, or a fortified bank may prevent an easy landing. Naval mobility offers freedom, but it also demands constant labor. Ships must be repaired, loaded, unloaded, dragged, guarded, and guided through unfamiliar waters. The boats lie close to the bank beneath a pale afternoon sky. Their hulls are streaked with mud where they have been drawn over shallow ground. Oars rest in neat rows, their handles worn smooth by many hands. A coil of rope smells strongly of tar and brine. Wet wool hangs from a rail, dark and heavy, while smoke from a nearby fire moves sideways in the wind. You hear a mallet striking a peg, then the rasp of a saw working through green timber. Beneath these sounds, water taps steadily against the planks. A gull settles on a mass and shakes rain from its feathers. The fleet waits for the tide, and the tide waits for the changing light. Edmund's resistance keeps the war alive, but every effort carries a cost. To recover Wessex, he must gather men from districts already strained by the campaign. To support London, he must move forces away from places where Danish authority is growing. Cnut faces the same pressure in another form. His Danish army has crossed the sea, and the longer it remains in England, the more it depends upon local stores, uncertain agreements, and the continuing support of the fleet. Neither king can easily abandon the struggle. A retreat may preserve an army while destroying a claim. A victory in one district may leave another exposed. By autumn 1016, both sides have suffered through a prolonged war of attrition, and endurance begins to matter as much as courage. The light fades early across the fields, leaving the hedgerows black against a dim green horizon. Mud clings to cart wheels and gathers beneath the edges of cloaks. Horses breathe clouds into the cold air. Somewhere in the darkness, a pot is set down upon a stone, and the small sound carries farther than expected. You smell boiled grain, damp leather, and wood smoke pressed flat by the weather. A sentry shifts his weight beside a gate. His spearhead catches a trace of firelight, then disappears again. Beyond the camp, the road runs towards the river. Along that road, men and animals have passed until the earth has become smooth, dark, and shining. The final conquest will not belong to the king who merely strikes hardest. Cnut's victory will depend as much on endurance and political support as on battlefield strength. He must persuade English nobles that Danish rule can endure while ensuring that his army remains supplied and capable of movement. Edmund must convince the country that resistance still has a future after months of raids, sieges, and uncertain allegiance. Their rivalry has become larger than the wishes of either man. It concerns the inheritance of England, the authority of Wessex, the reach of Denmark, and the older Scandinavian contest for the island kingdom. The ships, the walls, the roads, and the river all become part of the argument. Night rests upon the Thames. The water is almost black. A few lamps tremble near the shore, their reflections breaking and joining again. You stand beside the mud, hearing reeds whisper in the wind. The ships breathe gently against their ropes. Timber creaks. Somewhere nearby, a horse moves in its sleep. The air smells of rain, ash, and tar. The cold settles slowly into the ground. Across the dark water, London remains behind its walls. Elsewhere, Edmund's men gather beneath the same lowering sky. The kingdom is divided. The river runs between them. As autumn deepens, the movements of both armies become slower and more deliberate. Men count provisions. Officers study the roads. Horses are checked before dawn, and weapons are wrapped against the rain. Cnut's forces leave the river and return to it, keeping the fleet near enough to support their advance. Edmund's army moves from Wessex towards the contested districts, carrying the memory of every defeat and recovery. The long struggle has narrowed the choices before them. London has resisted. Wessex has changed hands. The nobles have declared themselves withdrawn or waited. Now the armies begin moving towards Essex, where the campaign will finally be decided. The road lies quiet beneath a colourless morning. Grass bends beneath droplets. A thin mist rests in the hollows. Behind you, the river fades into reeds and pale water. Ahead, the land rises gently, marked by hedges, fields, and distant smoke. Footsteps pass through wet earth. Harness leather gives a soft creak. A cloak brushes against a shield. The wind moves over the open ground, carrying the smell of leaves and wood smoke. You feel damp wool at your shoulders. You hear the low murmur of men walking. The pace is steady. The distance is uncertain. Essex waits beneath the autumn sky. In the soft, damp light of an Essex October, you move with Edmund's army across uncertain country, where grass lies cold beneath marching feet. Fields are divided by hedges and shallow ditches, while ridges rise and fall beneath a grey sky. Edmund has gathered his strength after a season of danger, yet the ground beneath him is not entirely secure. Danish forces possess strong local influence in Essex, and every village, track, and distant farmstead may conceal a watcher. The army advances carefully, carrying shields close against the wet air. Mail gives a muted clatter whenever the men change pace, and spear shafts knock softly against one another. Edmund's purpose is to reach ground where his forces can gather properly before Cnut's army brings its greater experience and numbers to bear. A thin mist rests among the lower fields, turning the hedgerows into dark horizontal lines. You feel water gathered along the edges of your boots, and each step presses a shallow impression into yielding soil. The breath of the men around you appears briefly, then dissolves into the October air. Cloaks hang heavily from damp shoulders, and leather straps have softened beneath the rain. Somewhere beyond the nearest ridge, a horse stamps against the cold, making the iron fittings of its harness tremble. Wind passes over the Essex heights with broad, unhurried motion, bending the grass and carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Nothing in the landscape seems hurried, although the army's movement has an urgency every soldier understands. The quiet country receives the marching column without offering any clear sign of what waits ahead. Cnut's scouts detect Edmund's movement before the English king can consolidate his position. Their work is quiet and practical, depending upon observation rather than spectacle. Riders watch roads from the shelter of woods, listen for wagons, and count the fires that appear after sunset. Messages pass swiftly between Danish commanders through territory where local sympathies and old arrangements favor Cnut's cause. Edmund's army is therefore not traveling through empty land, but through a region already threaded with information. The Danish forces learn where the English host is moving and how quickly it is approaching. Before Edmund can establish a secure camp or draw all his strength together, Cnut's army turns towards him. The meeting is shaped as much by scouting and timing as by courage beneath weapons. The afternoon light grows paler across the fields, and distant ridges seem to withdraw into mist. You hear the muted clatter of mail drawing closer as men tighten their formations. Wooden shield rims touch and separate with small, dry knocks. Wet wool mingles with horse sweat, oiled leather, and earth opened by wheels. Along the column's edges, officers speak in low voices, their words carried away almost immediately by the wind. A crow crosses above a distant copse, its wings dark against the silver cloud. The ground offers no grand theatre, only slopes, hollows, fences, and rough cart paths. Yet these ordinary features will determine how men advance, where ranks become crowded, and which soldiers can see danger approaching across the ridges. The Danish army intercepts Edmund before he can consolidate his position. The exact arrangements remain uncertain because medieval accounts differ over the battle's precise course. Some traditions place the fighting at Assandun in northern Essex, while others identify Assandun, farther south, as the field of Assandun. The disagreement has endured because surviving evidence is limited, shaped by later memory and by writers who wish to explain a decisive change in England's history. Whatever the precise ground, Edmund is forced to meet Cnut before achieving the secure concentration he intended. Assandun becomes more than a collision between two hosts. It becomes the meeting point of exhaustion, divided loyalties, careful scouting, and the narrowing of every available choice. The ridges stand beneath low cloud, their slopes darkened by moisture. You are among men who have marched through country where every farm may have heard news before them. Cold grass bends beneath sandals and boots, then rises slowly after the column passes. Wind moves over the ridges in long, even breaths, touching banners and loosening cloak edges. Horses toss their heads at the smell of the opposing host, while handlers murmur to keep them steady. The ground is neither soft enough to swallow movement nor firm enough to make it easy. Water glimmers in wheel ruts, reflecting a broken sky. Across the open spaces, figures gather in indistinct lines, and the distance between them seems to contain the fate of a kingdom. Edmund has already spent much of 1016 fighting to preserve the authority of the West Saxon dynasty. Cnut, meanwhile, has built upon Danish power established through earlier campaigns and settlements. The two kings do not meet as strangers. Each carries the weight of previous battles, alliances, oaths, and betrayals. English resistance has not vanished, but it has repeatedly been forced to recover from losses. Danish power has not become effortless, yet it is supported by a wide network of influence and by Cnut's ability to move quickly when an enemy is exposed. Assandun therefore gathers the accumulated strain of conquest into one place. On 18 October 1016, Edmund's army and Cnut's army meet in Essex, and the battle begins within a country already divided by years of war. Before the fighting's first great pressure, the field remains strangely open. You see damp grass shining between soldiers' feet, flattened in irregular paths where men have taken their positions. Spear shafts rise above the shields, dark and straight against the cloud. The leather grip feels cold beneath your hand, while the shield rim has become slick with rain and handling. Voices travel unevenly, sometimes clear for a few paces, sometimes lost beneath the shifting sound of many bodies. From the rear comes the faint creak of wagons and the restless movement of spare horses. A small fire burns somewhere beyond the lines, its smoke held low by the weather. Ash reaches you briefly, then disappears, as the wind changes across the ridge. The first stage of the battle is difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Medieval accounts describe the fighting differently, and later writers often arranged uncertain events into a clearer story than the evidence permits. English and Danish forces engage across the Essex ground, pressing against one another with locked shields and raised weapons. Edmund's army attempts to maintain its purpose under pressure, while Cnut's forces seek to exploit their advantage in movement, experience, and cohesion. Some accounts describe English desertions before or during the fighting, suggesting that not every man beneath Edmund's banners remained beside him when danger sharpened. Other traditions accuse Edric Striona of abandoning or betraying the English cause. The accusation is ancient and influential, yet its precise truth is not securely established. Moisture darkens the wood of the shields, and the field begins to lose its clean morning shape. You hear spear shafts striking wood, followed by the heavier sound of bodies meeting behind the shield wall. The earth receives straw, broken leather, and splinters from damaged boards. Wind moves above the combat without carrying its full tumult to distant farms. Smoke from cooking fires and disturbed embers hangs low after the fighting begins, mingling with mud and sweat. Men stumble where the turf has been torn open by repeated movement. A horse pulls against its reins, its breath loud and pale in the chill. Beyond the immediate ranks, the ridges remain quiet, and the hedges keep their patient lines, as though the land knows nothing of the struggle. The story of Edric Striona must be held with care. He was a powerful nobleman in Mercia, a region whose political position often shifted between English and Danish interests. Later tradition portrays him as a figure whose treachery helped secure Cnut's victory, and some accounts connect him with the collapse of English resistance at Assandun. Yet a calm reading of the sources cannot turn accusation into settled fact. Edric's reputation had become associated with political uncertainty, and hostile writers had reasons to remember him as the embodiment of divided loyalty. There may have been desertions, confusion, or failures of command without one act explaining the entire outcome. Assandun was shaped by many pressures, including scouting, exhaustion, local influence, and the unequal condition of the armies before the clash. The air carries the wet scent of bruised grass, and your cloak brushes against a shield as the line shifts. Beneath your feet, the ground has become flattened stems and dark, shining mud. Mail continues its muted clatter even when individual voices fall silent. A spear is lifted, lowered, and lifted again, its polished point catching the weak light. From the slopes, banners appear and vanish behind moving bodies, their colors softened by mist. Hooves reach you from beyond the main press, followed by the creak of harness leather. Smoke gathers close to the field and drifts in pale strips across the lower ground. The October wind remains cold upon your face, but movement warms your hands beneath the damp wool. Cnut's army ultimately defeats Edmund's forces. The victory does not arise from one dramatic instant, because battles of this period often turn through pressure repeated over many hours. A shield wall weakens, a gap opens, a commander struggles to make himself heard, and men begin to understand that the ground beneath them is no longer held securely. English resistance is brave and persistent, but it cannot restore the position Edmund hoped to establish. The Danish army retains the greater ability to shape the encounter, while uncertainty spreads through the English ranks. When fighting finally moves away from the field, Cnut has achieved the result that matters most. Assandun becomes the closing battle of the Danish conquest of England, and organized resistance to Cnut's advance effectively ends. Evening settles slowly over the damaged ridges, leaving the field marked by dark shapes and broken equipment. You stand where grass has been pressed flat, and the soil holds prints of men, horses, and hurried feet. Wind passes over the Essex country with less resistance now, travelling between abandoned shields and fallen spear shafts. Smoke hangs low after the fighting, pale against darkening fields. Fires begin to appear at a distance, each small and uncertain through the haze. The army's sounds have diminished into isolated calls, moving horses, and the occasional creak of a cart. A torn strap shifts against wood whenever the breeze reaches it. Night comes without ceremony, covering the field in layers of damp shadow. The exact location of Assandun remains disputed between Ashton and Ashington in Essex. Ashton lies in the county's northern part, while Ashington stands farther south, near the coast and close to the place traditionally associated with Cnut's memorial church. The distinction matters to historians, but uncertainty does not lessen the battle's political importance. In either landscape, the armies would have encountered rolling ground, cultivated fields, hedges, and the open wind of Essex. The name Assandun may have changed as it passed through records and local memories. No surviving document settles the matter beyond dispute. You remain upon a field whose exact name cannot be fixed with certainty, while the consequences of the battle are clearer than its geography. Night moisture gathers on abandoned grass, and the ridges lose their edges beneath the dark. You hear men carrying water, tending wounds, or searching for companions among the shadows. A few embers glow within low smoke, giving the air a weak reddish color before the flames sink again. The smell of wet earth strengthens as warmth leaves the ground. Somewhere beyond the field, a dog barks once and falls quiet. Wind moves through the hedges with a soft rustling that resembles distant speech. Leather, wool, and wood absorb the dampness of night. The battlefield rests beneath the same October sky that watched the armies assemble, although England's balance has changed upon the earth below. After Assandun, Edmund and Cnut reach an agreement dividing the kingdom between them. Edmund retains Wessex, the historic heartland of his family, while Cnut controls the rest of England. The settlement recognizes the practical reality created by the battle without immediately requiring every region to submit to one ruler. It also contains a remarkable provision concerning inheritance. The survivor will inherit the other king's territory, so the division is not intended to continue indefinitely. Cnut can therefore present his eventual takeover as lawful succession rather than simple seizure. Edmund has not surrendered every claim, and Cnut has not yet received the whole kingdom, but the agreement gives the new order a form recognizable through oaths, custom, and royal authority. In the days after the fighting, roads become quieter, though dampness remains beneath hedges and around cart tracks. You pass through country where people speak cautiously, measuring each word against the new balance of power. Cold grass has begun to lift in places, but broad patches remain pressed into the earth. Smoke rises from farmsteads in thin columns, and peat mingles with wet leaves. Messengers travel between settlements carrying news of the agreement. A horse's hooves strike a wooden bridge, producing a hollow rhythm over dark water. Along the road, broken spear shafts may still lie among weeds. The land continues its ordinary work, while the names of two kings move from mouth to mouth across Essex. Wessex remains under Edmund, and its possession carries deep meaning because the West Saxon line has long represented an English alternative to Danish rule. Cnut controls the remainder of England, including regions where his forces have established influence and resistance has weakened through years of conflict. The arrangement is not a peaceful balance created by mutual confidence. It is a settlement produced by exhaustion, military necessity, and the recognition that continued fighting may destroy what both kings wish to govern. For the moment, the kingdom has two rulers and one uncertain future. The agreement leaves Edmund with Wessex, gives Cnut the greater portion of England, and binds their territories to the survival of whichever king remains longer upon the earth. A pale morning arrives over the fields, revealing beads of water along the grass and thin vapor above the ditches. You feel chill settling into the seams of your clothing as first light touches the hedgerows. Wind is quieter than before, but still travels across the Essex ridges with clean, cool pressure. Wheel marks deepen where carts have passed through softened ground. A crow rests upon a fence post, its feathers dark against the silver horizon. Nearby, men repair a shield with fresh leather, pulling the fastening tight and testing the wood beneath it. Smoke rises straight for a moment before bending eastward. The field appears less violent in daylight, yet every trampled hollow holds a trace of what happened there. On 30 November 1016, only weeks after Assandun, Edmund dies. Contemporary evidence does not securely establish the cause. Later stories offer different explanations, some dramatic and some shaped by the desire to give the king's passing a memorable form. The surviving record permits certainty about the date, but not about the illness, injury, or circumstance that ended his life. Edmund's death changes the meaning of the settlement made with Cnut. What had been an agreement between two living kings becomes the mechanism through which one ruler inherits the other's territory. Wessex, which Edmund retained after the battle, now stands without its king. The political division created after Assandun, therefore, closes with extraordinary speed, leaving Cnut positioned to receive the whole kingdom. The last days of November carry sharper cold across the countryside. You walk beneath bare branches where remaining leaves tremble in the wind and fall upon darkening paths. Frost gathers along grass edges, whitening places where rain had rested. The air smells of smoke from distant hearths, damp timber, and the faint bitterness of fallen leaves. In villages, shutters close earlier, and work fades before the sky has entirely darkened. A horse exhales beside a stable wall, its breath forming a small cloud beneath the eaves. Essex fields lie quiet, but news of Edmund's death moves outward along roads and river crossings. Each messenger carries the same date into a country already prepared for change. After Edmund's death, Wessex accepts Cnut as king. This acceptance may contain resignation, calculation, and recognition that no organized force remains capable of reversing the outcome. Cnut is recognized as King of all England in 1016, completing the political transformation begun through Conquest and confirmed at Assandun. The agreement with Edmund allows him to present this final takeover as lawful succession, supported by terms arranged between the two kings. His authority is no longer confined to territories held by Danish arms. It extends across the kingdom through military victory, inheritance, submission, and public recognition. The battle has ended, Edmund has died, and the divided arrangement of Wessex and the rest of England has become one royal government. A quiet field lies beneath a winter-leaning sky, with frost touching flattened grass and old wagon tracks. You hear no armor nearby, only the soft creak of a gate moving in the breeze. Smoke rises from a distant settlement and spreads thinly over the low ground. Wind crosses the ridges with a colder edge than it had in October, carrying damp soil and ash. Hedges hold small beads of ice along their branches. A raven passes above the fields, its wings making no audible sound from the earth below. In the hollows, water reflects the pale sky. The land does not announce Cnut's rule, yet every road, village, and manor now lies within one king's authority. The political foundation of the Anglo-Scandinavian realm is created through battle, treaty, death, and recognition. Cnut's victory gives him military authority to demand obedience, while the agreement with Edmund provides a legal shape for transferring power. The new realm is not simply Danish territory laid over an English landscape. It is a kingdom formed from English institutions, Scandinavian connections, existing noble families, and a monarch able to present himself through several political traditions. Assandun helps make that combination possible. The battle closes the Danish conquest, but also opens a period in which England belongs to a wider North Sea world. Cnut's rule will connect the kingdom to Denmark, Norway, and the maritime routes of northern Europe. Beyond the fields, winter light rests upon farmhouse roofs and distant woods. You stand beside a hedge where rough branches press beneath your fingers and drops of water collect in the bark. A mill wheel turns slowly beyond the nearest rise, its wooden rhythm softened by distance. The smell of bread and smoke drifts from a settlement, offering brief warmth to the cold air. On the road, a cart passes with a low groan, its wheels sinking into brown earth. Open ridges receive the wind without shelter. Every sound seems measured and remote, as though the countryside has drawn a long breath after years of war. The fields remain ordinary, although the kingdom around them has become newly connected. Cnut later founds a memorial church for those who died in the battle. The church known as Assandun Minster is completed in 1020 near the traditionally identified battlefield. Its foundation gives physical form to a memory that had traveled through stories, chronicles, and the names of the dead. Assandun Minster does not remove the dispute between Ashton and Assandun, but it shows how strongly the southern location became associated with Assandun. A church built near the remembered field turns royal victory into sacred remembrance, joining political authority with care for souls. The stones stand for those who fought on different sides, even while the institution belongs to the ruler who emerged from the struggle. The memorial preserves grief, power, and legitimacy within one quiet place. Years pass across the Essex landscape, and the imagined bell of a church begins to belong to later memory. You hear it in the mind rather than across the actual field, a slow note carried over grass, hedges, and low ridges. The sound moves through mist, touching places where shields once stood and broken spear shafts lay among weeds. Morning light settles upon church walls, pale and cool, while rain darkens stones near the ground. Inside, the air carries timber, wax, and old dust. Outside, wind moves through grass like distant water. Assandun Minster remains near the traditionally identified battlefield, holding the name Assandun beneath its later silence. The Battle of Assandun is often treated as the closing battle of the Danish conquest because organized resistance effectively ends with Cnut's victory. Other struggles and submissions follow, but the essential contest for the kingdom has been decided. Edmund's defeat prevents him from consolidating his position, and the settlement places Cnut in control of most of England. Edmund's death on 30 November removes the remaining division between Wessex and the rest of the country. Wessex accepts Cnut, who is recognized as king of all England in that same year. The path from battlefield to monarchy is therefore unusually direct. Assandun is both an ending and a hinge, closing one political order while opening the Anglo-Scandinavian realm. The church bell imagined across the quiet field sounds again within later centuries. You stand beneath weak sunlight, and grass moves in broad silver-green patterns around you. The minster's masonry holds the morning cold, while moss darkens its lower stones. A raven calls from a distant tree, and the sound fades into wind before another answer comes. Rain has left shallow pools along the path, each reflecting a fragment of cloud. Wet earth rises where footsteps disturb the surface. Within the church, timber settles with a small creak, and wax has hardened near a candle's base. Across the ridge, the imagined bell continues its slow passage through the air, marking a place where memory has outlasted certainty. The disagreement over betrayal remains part of Assandun's history, but it need not resolve into a single dramatic explanation. Medieval writers preserved these possibilities differently, and later readers often preferred one clear villain to the complicated reality of uncertain loyalties. The evidence permits caution. Desertion may reflect fear, exhaustion, divided allegiance, or confusion in a battle whose movements cannot be fully recovered. Edric may have acted opportunistically, yet the sources do not allow every later accusation to become fact. The outcome is certain, even where motives remain shadowed. Cnut's army defeated Edmund's forces, and England passed into a new political arrangement. Dusk gathers over the remembered battlefield, and ridges become soft shapes beneath a violet-grey sky. You feel evening cold through the soles of your shoes as grass bends around your ankles. Wind has weakened, leaving only faint movement among hedge leaves and dry stems. Smoke from a distant cottage lies close to the ground, carrying peat and burning wood. A gate latch taps gently against its post whenever air stirs. Beyond the fields, a church bell may be imagined across the quiet country, one measured note followed by another. The sound is not loud enough to disturb the dark. It belongs to distance, memory, and the patient endurance of places that have received many generations. The settlement between Edmund and Cnut allows Cnut to present his takeover as lawful succession rather than simple seizure. This distinction matters because kingship depends upon more than possession of land. It requires recognition from nobles, churches, local communities, and the wider political world. By accepting the agreement, Cnut gains a framework through which the transfer of Edmund's territory can be understood as the fulfillment of an established promise. The survivor will inherit the other king's lands, and Edmund's death fulfills that condition. Wessex therefore enters Cnut's kingdom through the treaty's own logic, even though the treaty was born from defeat. Law and force stand together at Assandun, each giving the other a different kind of strength. Moonlight reaches the wet fields, turning ditch water into narrow strips of dull silver. You walk slowly beside a hedge whose thorns catch threads of mist. Soil gives softly beneath your feet, and old cartwheel marks remain visible where the ground has dried unevenly. A faint smell of smoke passes over the ridge from an unseen hearth. The breeze touches the grass, withdraws, and returns from another direction. Somewhere in darkness, a night bird calls once, then leaves the field to silence. The imagined bell of Ashington Minster seems to rest beyond the horizon, waiting within later centuries. Nothing moves upon the old battlefield except weather, which smooths the marks of men. The consequence of Edmund's death is not only personal, although the king's loss changes the fate of his family and kingdom. It removes the living figure around whom Wessex might have gathered again. Cnut inherits the territory promised by the settlement, and the remaining resistance becomes impossible to organize on the same scale. In 1016, Cnut is recognized as king of all England. The event gives a formal ending to a struggle that began with Danish invasions generations earlier and continued through shifting claims, temporary agreements, and repeated campaigns. Assandun is remembered because it makes the final transition visible. On 18 October, armies fought in Essex. On 30 November, Edmund died. Before the year ended, Cnut possessed the kingdom. The night air is still above the fields, and frost begins to gather upon broken stems. You hear grass brushing against grass, a sound so gentle that it seems almost imagined. Cold reaches the wooden fence beside you, leaving its surface hard beneath your palm. In the distance, a single cottage light trembles when wind passes through the trees. Smoke hangs close to roofs, spreading slowly over gardens and lanes. Ridges hold their shape beneath the stars, though mist gathers in hollows where the river once faded into reeds. Across the quiet field, the later church bell returns as an inward sound, broad and low, giving the vanished dead a place within the living landscape. Assandun helps create the political foundation of the Anglo-Scandinavian realm by joining military conquest to a durable royal structure. Cnut's kingdom extends beyond England, but England becomes one of its central lands, governed through local practice and Scandinavian connection. The battle permits Cnut to establish authority where earlier Danish rulers often relied upon temporary occupation or negotiated submission. The treaty gives his accession a language of inheritance, while Wessex's acceptance confirms that language in practice. The memorial church near Assandun adds a religious dimension to the victory and preserves the battle within the landscape. Through these linked events, the field becomes part of a wider world shaped by the North Sea. Morning returns with quiet brightness over Essex, and the ridges appear once more beneath a pale sky. You stand among grasses silvered by dew, listening to distant farms stir. The earth is firm where night has cooled it, although water remains in the deepest hollows. A light wind moves over the open ground and lifts your cloak's edge. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, a cart crosses a road, its wheels making a soft, irregular rhythm. Smoke rises in narrow strands, then bends above the trees. The smell of wet leaves is clean and faintly sweet. In later years, a church bell can be imagined across this quiet field, recalling Assandun, Assandun, and the men who disappeared into England's history. The name Assandun carries the memory of a battle whose location remains unsettled between Ashton and Assandun. The date, 18 October 1016, remains firm, as does the political outcome. Edmund's army moved through a region of Danish influence. Cnut's scouts detected its approach, and the Danish army intercepted Edmund before he could consolidate his position. The fighting was shaped by uncertainty, possible desertions, and traditions of betrayal that cannot be accepted without qualification. Cnut's army defeated Edmund's forces, and organized resistance effectively ended. After the battle, Edmund retained Wessex, and Cnut controlled the rest of England, while their agreement promised the survivor the other king's territory. Within weeks, Edmund died, and that promise became reality. The field is quiet beneath late morning light, with damp grass leaning in the prevailing wind. You feel the hedge's roughness where rain has dried upon the bark, leaving a thin sheen behind. A distant bell seems to cross the air from Assandun Minster, though the sound belongs to imagination and later remembrance. The note fades above the ridges, leaving rustling leaves and the small movement of a bird among branches. Smoke from a nearby chimney drifts low, carrying warmth without heat. Paths are empty, ditches calm, and the earth has begun to conceal marks left by armies. Only the open horizon remains unchanged. In this way, the battle becomes the closing movement of the Danish conquest and the opening of Cnut's Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom. Victory at Assandun gives Cnut military supremacy. The settlement with Edmund gives him a lawful path towards succession, and Edmund's death removes the last division of royal authority. Wessex accepts Cnut, and England recognizes him as king in 1016. Assandun Minster, completed in 1020 near the traditionally identified battlefield, preserves a later memory of the dead and of the ruler who ordered their remembrance. The exact ridge may remain debated, but the encounter's meaning is clear. On an October field in Essex, exhaustion and loyalty met careful scouting, and a kingdom changed hands beneath the cold wind. The last light fades over the ridges, leaving the fields in quiet layers of grey and blue. You stand where grass bends beneath evening air, and the earth feels cool through your shoes. A faint smell of wood smoke moves from distant houses and disappears into darkness. Hedges become black lines against the paling sky, while water in the ditches gathers the first reflections of night. No armor sounds upon the road now, and no spear shafts knock together in the mist. Only the breeze continues, traveling over Essex as it traveled over the armies in October 1016. Far away, a church bell may be imagined across the field, slow and measured, while Assandun rests within the silence of the kingdom it helped to create. The noise of conquest had scarcely faded before Cnut faced the quieter labor of making England governable. At Assandun, in October 1016, victory had given him the throne, but victory alone could not administer a kingdom. Across England, the king encountered bishops, earls, law courts, royal officials, and communities accustomed to older ceremonies of authority. The country had been battered by invasion, yet its habits of government remained embedded in churches, estates, boroughs, and shires. You are standing within a royal hall where rushes lie beneath your feet, darkened by many winters of use. Beyond the timber walls, rain moves softly across the fields, and smoke drifts beneath the roof beams. Cnut was crowned King of England in 1017, and the ceremony placed him within an English tradition older than his conquest. Bishops surrounded the throne, sacred words passed through the air, and the crown transformed a victorious warlord into a Christian king. The political work began immediately. Cnut divided England into earldoms and relied upon powerful regional officials who could command men, collect revenues, hear disputes, and maintain the king's peace across distant territories. Warm beeswax softened beneath a seal, while a clerk pressed its surface against a tablet prepared for the royal household. Latin and Old English words moved across parchment, joining Danish authority to English forms. Among the new king's principal decisions was the removal of Edric Striona, the Mercian earl whose shifting loyalties had troubled the final years of Ethelred Roman II and Edmund Ironside. Edric was killed on Cnut's orders in 1017. His death carried a severe message through the kingdom. Men who had survived by changing sides could not assume that service would protect them forever, while the king demonstrated that mercy and danger remained closely joined beneath his crown. Inside a monastery scriptorium, the air carries the smell of beeswax, lamp smoke, damp wool, and scraped parchment. A small window admits grey brightness, and rain taps steadily upon the roof of an English church. Cnut's rule did not attempt to erase the machinery of English kingship. The new king retained many elements of existing royal administration because established institutions were useful precisely when conquest had made the country uncertain. English law codes continued under Danish rule, and royal writs carried the king's commands in forms that English landholders and officials already understood. Danish power therefore travelled through familiar channels. Your hand rests near a folded piece of parchment whose edges have curled in the warmth. A lamp trembles beside it, and the faint scrape of a quill joins the deeper hush of the building. Royal charters addressed bishops, earls, and the wider English people, presenting Cnut as a ruler whose authority extended through every order of society. The language was Christian, formal, and carefully continuous with the reigns that had preceded him. That public language mattered because the throne had been secured through violence. A king who wished to remain king had to appear more than victorious. He had to appear lawful, settled, and responsible for the welfare of the kingdom. You are moving slowly along the edge of the hall, where woven hangings soften the draught. Beneath the scent of wood smoke, there is the sharper fragrance of wet leather, wool, and wax from recently opened documents. Cnut used lawmaking and public peace as important signs of legitimate rule. His authority was expressed through commands against theft, disorder, and violence, while his officials were expected to make the king's peace visible in ordinary life. The contrast was deliberate. The same ruler whose orders had ended Edric Striona's career now spoke in the measured language of Christian kingship, promising stability beneath a crown born from war. Far away, rain gathers along the eaves and falls into the darkness below. A horse shifts within a stable, straw gives a muted rustle, and a bell sounds once from a church beyond the settlement. In 1017, Cnut married Emma of Normandy, a union that joined the new king to the Old English royal house and to the duchy across the Channel. Emma had previously been Queen of England as Ethelred Roman II wife. The marriage was not merely a private arrangement. It connected Cnut with the dynasty he had displaced while preserving a relationship with Normandy, where Emma's family possessed influence, memory, and political weight. The Queen's chamber is warm from a brazier, though the stone around the doorway remains cold. Linen hangs in pale folds, and a narrow flame shines upon metal fittings, carved wood, and a small cross. Emma brought with her a history that could not be ignored. She had known the English court before the Danish conquest, and her presence allowed Cnut's government to present itself as a continuation rather than a complete rupture. The marriage settlement appears to have strengthened Cnut's public legitimacy. It gave the new dynasty a place within the story of English royalty, even while Scandinavian companions remained evident around him. Outside the church, wet grass bends beneath the weight of the weather. The stones under your feet shine with rain, and the smell of earth rises from the churchyard beside the quiet wall. Cnut and Emma had a son, Harthecnut, probably born in 1018 or 1019. His birth gave the marriage a dynastic future and offered the kingdom a child who belonged to both the conquering house and the older royal tradition. Cnut also had a son, Harold Harefoot, with Aelfjafu of Northampton. The existence of two sons, connected to different women and political circles, would later give the succession a delicate and uncertain shape. Within the royal household, several forms of loyalty could exist at once. English nobles, Danish warriors, Scandinavian settlers, bishops, queens, and regional officials all looked towards the same throne from different positions. In the monastery, parchment dries slowly beside a low fire. The room is filled with the scent of smoke and wax, while rain continues to tap the roof tiles with patient, irregular fingers. Cnut appointed both Scandinavian and English nobles to positions of authority. This mixture allowed him to reward those who had helped him conquer England while preserving the cooperation of men whose families already possessed land and influence. Thorkel the Tall became one of Cnut's leading earls in England. His stature was remembered, but his political importance rested upon something more practical. He represented the strength of Scandinavian leadership within the new order. At the same time, English men continued to serve in government, local administration, and the courts. Cnut's kingdom did not become Danish in every habit, nor did it remain wholly English beneath a foreign name. A long table has been cleared for documents, though crumbs remain among the rushes. Near the wall, a servant feeds a lamp with oil, and the wavering light touches the red surface of a wax seal. The pattern was one of accommodation. Cnut's government combined conquest with established English institutions because the kingdom could not be ruled from a ship, a battlefield, or a single royal residence. His officials depended upon local knowledge. They needed to understand boundaries, customary dues, the rights of churches, the obligations of landholders, and the relationships connecting villages to estates and estates to earldoms. Through such arrangements, Danish rule became present in England without requiring every English practice to be dismantled. The king's authority entered existing structures and used them to carry new commands. A cold draught moves beneath the door and stirs the rushes around your ankles. Above, the roof timbers hold the smell of smoke, while outside the churchyard grass whispers beneath the rain. Scandinavian newcomers entered the English aristocracy during Cnut's reign, acquiring lands, offices, and reputations within a society that had once regarded them as invaders. Their advancement showed how conquest could become settlement. Some newcomers brought memories of Denmark, Norway, or the wider northern seas. Yet their fortunes now depended upon English estates, tenants, law, and continued service to an English king. The process was visible in the changing names of power. Old families remained important, but new earls appeared beside them, and England's political map slowly gathered a northern colouring. In a scriptorium, a clerk leans close to the page, shielding the ink from a wandering current of air. Beeswax clings to the edge of a tablet, and the low light makes each letter seem carefully carved. Siward, probably of Scandinavian background, became an important northern power under Cnut. His rise reveals how the king's authority depended upon regional men who could transform royal commands into practical control. By the early 1030s, Siward controlled southern Northumbria as Cnut's Earl. Northumbria lay distant from the centres of southern government, and its management required strength, judgment, and an ability to work among powerful local interests. The appointment formed part of a larger method through which Cnut placed dependable men in regions where distance, old rivalries, and memories of violence could weaken royal authority. A northern wind presses against the church walls, though the interior remains still. Rain ticks upon the roof, and the stone floor keeps the cool scent of water, ash, and ancient dust. Siward's power also demonstrates the delegated character of Cnut's empire. The king could claim authority over England, Denmark, and eventually Norway, but he could not personally supervise every court, estate, harbour, or troubled border. Regional earls therefore became extensions of the crown. Their halls, retainers, and judgments gave Cnut's rule a local body, while their dependence upon royal favour kept their authority connected to the centre. In southern Northumbria, Siward's position linked the northern shires to the wider kingdom. His authority showed how Cnut's arrangements could endure beyond the immediate excitement of conquest. The fire has settled into glowing embers, giving little heat but a steady red light. Your cloak holds the faint smell of rain, and the rushes feel dry where the hearth has warmed them. Law and religion strengthened the same structure. Cnut supported churches, monasteries, and religious foundations in England, giving gifts of land, treasure, and protection to institutions that shaped both memory and public authority. The king's Christian presentation was not ornamental alone. Bishops could preserve records, explain royal commands, supervise communities, and place the monarchy within a sacred understanding of order. Cnut's charters spoke to bishops, earls, and the wider English people, because his kingship had to be heard across every level of the realm. Their words moved from the royal centre into churches, estates, and assemblies. A single lamp burns beside a crucifix, its flame bending when the door opens. Wax glows on a nearby tablet, and drops of rain travel slowly down the narrow window. Cnut's public image was therefore carefully composed. He appeared as a Christian ruler who protected the church, upheld law, and gathered a divided country beneath a single peace. Yet beneath this image remained the memory of armies, executions, hostages, and forced submission. The peace was real, but it rested upon the ability of the king and his earls to punish those who challenged it. That uneasy balance gave the reign its particular character. England was not simply pacified because old loyalties remained, but it was no longer governed through open battle alone. Rain passes across the roof in a long, soft sweep, then thins into separate taps. Somewhere beyond the walls, water runs along a ditch, carrying leaves through the blackness beside the road. Cnut's lawmaking helped turn peace into a royal responsibility. A ruler who could prevent feud, restrain theft, and protect churches demonstrated that conquest had produced a useful order. The king's authority became familiar through repeated forms. Writs were read, charters were witnessed, payments were collected, disputes were heard, and officials acted in the name of the crown. Each act was small when viewed alone, yet together they made Danish rule appear orderly, Christian, and continuous. The kingdom learned the shape of Cnut's government through ordinary procedures rather than ceremony alone. Your feet cross a floor covered with rushes that have absorbed years of smoke and footsteps. Beeswax remains close to the walls, mingling with damp wool and the faint sweetness of stored grain. Emma's position within this arrangement was equally important. As Ethelred Roman II, former wife, she embodied the connection between the conquered dynasty and the king who had replaced it. Her marriage to Cnut did not erase the past, and it did not make the Danish conquest gentle. It gave the conquest a language of inheritance, joining separate lines of memory within one royal household. Cnut, probably born in 1018 or 1019, became the living promise of that union. Through him, Cnut and Emma could present their future as rooted in both England and the wider northern world. At the edge of the church, a drop falls from the eaves onto a stone step. The sound is quiet but distinct, and the wet air carries the smell of moss between the joints. Harold Harefoot, Cnut's son with Aelfjafu of Northampton, represented another strand of the king's family and another set of political relationships. His presence ensured that succession would not be simple. For the moment, however, Cnut's authority remained strong enough to contain these possibilities. The kingdom was occupied by one ruler, and the court could present the household as a source of continuity. The future would later expose tensions that were not yet visible. During these years, the essential task was to make the present seem stable so that obedience could become habit. A thin line of smoke rises from the hearth and disappears among the rafters. The fire gives a gentle crack, while the roof answers with the muted patter of continuing rain. The king's government rested upon people who could carry his intentions into places he seldom saw. Thorkel, Siward, bishops, clerks, and English officials all occupied different parts of this broad arrangement. Their positions were valuable because England was a country of distances. Roads were slow, rivers changed with the seasons, and information traveled at the pace of horses, ships, and human voices. Delegated authority allowed Cnut to rule beyond his immediate presence. An earl could gather men in the north, a bishop could preserve a charter, and a local official could enforce a royal judgment. In the quiet church, water strikes the roof in uneven patterns. The sound moves from one side of the building to the other, while the wooden door holds back the colder darkness. Cnut's kingship depended on making Danish rule appear orderly, Christian, and continuous. This appearance was not merely a disguise, because the systems he adopted genuinely shaped England's government. The old administration survived, but it carried new personnel and new loyalties. English law codes continued beneath a Danish crown, while royal writs spoke in forms familiar to those who had served earlier kings. The result was neither simple replacement nor simple preservation. It was a new political settlement built from conquest, marriage, religion, legal habit, and the careful distribution of power. Wax has cooled into a dull red seal beside the clerk's hand. The parchment lies flat now, and the letters catch the lamplight while the monastery settles into nightly silence. In 1017, Cnut's crown rested upon military success, but a crown could not be defended by soldiers at every hour. It required ceremonies, offices, laws, churches, marriages, and men whose fortunes depended upon the king. The killing of Edric Striona showed the violence behind the settlement. The marriage to Emma showed its dynastic ambition. Charters and law codes showed the patient work of making authority ordinary. Thorkel demonstrated the importance of Scandinavian allies, while Siward's later power in southern Northumbria revealed how deeply regional government shaped the new kingdom. Across England, the transition from invasion to administration took place quietly, often beneath the notice of those who experienced it. A writ arrived, a boundary was confirmed, a court assembled, and the king's peace gained another foundation. Night presses gently against the windows of the hall. The rain has softened to mist, and the air inside is marked by old wood, cooling ash, and the faint fragrance of wax. In time, Cnut would be remembered as a ruler of several realms, but England remained central to the reputation he was building. Its churches, laws, royal customs, and noble families gave his kingship a depth that conquest alone could never provide. The Danish king entered an English political world and learned to govern through it. His success depended upon recognizing that durable power often lies in adapting to institutions rather than destroying them. The kingdom therefore settled into an uneasy peace. Danish newcomers rose among English nobles, established officials continued their work, and regional earls carried royal authority across the country. The fire fades, and the darkness beyond the walls becomes indistinguishable from that beneath the roof. Rain taps once more upon the church, while parchment and wax rest quietly on the table. Cnut had been crowned King of England in 1017, yet the meaning of that crown unfolded gradually. It became the center of a government joining Scandinavian ambition to English practice. Cnut's rule was Christian in its public language and royal presentation, but its calm could not conceal the hard decisions that had secured the throne. The contradiction remained at the heart of the reign. Edric Striona was dead by royal order, while bishops received charters and monasteries received protection. Emma stood beside the conqueror, and Harthacnut carried the promise of a shared dynastic future. In the north, Siward gathered authority under Cnut, and by the early 1030s he controlled southern Northumbria as the king's earl. Such men made the distant monarchy tangible. The rain ceases, leaving only water falling from the eaves. Across the sleeping fields, the church stands dark and steady, holding within its walls the quiet traces of England's new order. The work of Cnut's reign was to persuade England that Danish rule could be permanent without being wholly unfamiliar. Laws remained, writs continued, churches were supported, and old customs were placed beneath a new sovereign. This was the art of accommodation, and it required more patience than battle. The king had to reward companions without alienating English nobles, strengthen earls without allowing them independence, and speak to the church without surrendering royal control. His government combined conquest with continuity until the distinction between the two became difficult to separate. A Danish king governed through English habits, and England carried those habits into a new political age. The hall is almost still now, with only the quiet movement of a sleeper beyond the partition. The rushes lie undisturbed, and a last ember gives the wax seal a dull amber glow. When Cnut's name travelled through England, it carried several meanings at once. It recalled the fleet and battlefield, the crown and charter, the foreign warrior and Christian king. It also carried the memory of Emma, the queen who joined the old English house to the new ruling family. Through their marriage, Normandy entered the story, and the kingdom's future became part of wider northern politics. Harthacnut and Harold Harefoot stood as separate possibilities within that future. Their existence reflected the complicated household from which Cnut's dynasty would continue, and the alliances surrounding each branch. For the present, however, the kingdom rested beneath one authority. Cnut's earls watched their regions, bishops maintained their foundations, and clerks continued to write the king's piece in Latin and Old English. The night air has grown clear after rain, though moisture still shines upon the stones. A faint scent of wet grass rises from the churchyard, and the distant fields are quiet beneath the stars. By the early 1030s, the settlement created after Assandun had become more than a military occupation. It was a functioning kingship, held together by officials, ceremonies, laws, religious institutions, and local cooperation. Cnut's crown remained Danish in origin, but its authority had become recognizably English in operation. The old royal administration had not vanished. It had been absorbed into a larger Scandinavian monarchy. Siward's northern power, Thorkel's earldom, Emma's marriage, and the continued use of English law all belonged to the same pattern. Each connected the conquering king to institutions, people, or memories that could sustain his rule. The roof of the church gives a final small creak as the night temperature falls. Inside, the scent of lamp smoke lingers above the stones, and rainwater settles into the dark earth. The uneasy peace of Cnut's England was therefore not a pause between wars, but a political construction. Its materials were old and new, English and Scandinavian, violent and devotional, personal and administrative. The kingdom had been taken by force, yet it was governed through accommodation. Its ruler had come from across the sea, yet he relied upon English law, churches, clerks, and an English queen. In the soft distance between one century and the next, Cnut's government made conquest appear continuous with kingship. The transformation was gradual, and its traces remained in every writ, charter, earldom, and protected monastery. Beyond the church, the road lies dark beneath wet hedges. No armor sounds upon it now, and no spear shafts knock together in the mist. Only the quiet machinery of rule continues. A clerk closes the chest, a bishop keeps the seal, an earl watches the northern road, and the king's peace moves outward through England. Cnut, crowned in 1017, remains a significant figure in English history. His name passes through the written record, Emma's household, Thorkel's earldom, and Siward's northern authority. The old kingdom has not disappeared, and the new one has not fully settled. Beneath the Christian language of the crown, the memory of conquest still lies quiet, but present beneath the surface of peace. At dawn, you are standing beside the sea lanes, where the same wind may carry a royal message from England towards Denmark, or from Denmark onwards to Norway. The water is dark beneath a pale sky, and the horizon appears without a boundary, as though the kingdoms beyond it have been folded into the same quiet expanse. Salt spray gathers on the carved ship's prow, silvering the worn wood and darkening the rope coils. Around you, the harbour is crowded with foreign tongues, timber hulls, woolen cloaks, leather shoes, and barrels marked for distant markets. The creak of oars rises and falls beside the soft knocking of vessels against their moorings. Cnut's achievement was geographical before it was administrative. Several kingdoms were held together by water, ships, tribute, and personal allegiance, rather than by a single road, a single capital, or a continuous stretch of territory. His power reached across the North Sea because the sea itself offered a broad and comparatively efficient highway between distant royal centres. The political centre of this realm was not a single compact landmass. England lay to the west, Denmark rested across the northern approaches, and Norway extended along its long, mountainous coast. Parts of southern Sweden entered the pattern through alliance, rivalry, and influence, while the lands around the North Sea remained connected by commerce, dynastic relationships, and the movement of armed men. Overland routes would have been slower, rougher, and more uncertain. A message travelling from the English court towards Denmark could cross the sea with a favourable wind, while a fleet might carry treasure, soldiers, envoys, and royal authority in the same passage. Cnut travelled between his kingdoms, and his fleets projected authority wherever their sails appeared above the horizon. The sea does not seem hurried tonight. Its surface rises gently beneath the long pull of the tide, and the wind presses against your cheek with a cold, clean touch. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a watchman calls from a pier, while ropes strain softly against wooden posts. In Denmark, the royal presence rested upon older structures of kingship, local lordship, and maritime power. The Danish kingdom gave Cnut a strategic base across the North Sea and along the approaches to the Baltic, placing him close to routes that reached towards Sweden, the southern Scandinavian coast, and the German lands bordering the sea. Cnut became king of Denmark around 1019, succeeding his brother Harold. From 1019 until his death in 1035, Denmark remained one of the principal foundations of his authority. It was not merely territory to be possessed, but a source of ships, noble connections, tribute, and access to the northern waters. His relationship with Scandinavian nobles was maintained through tribute, appointments, and marriage alliances. Such arrangements could bind powerful families to the king without requiring constant occupation. A nobleman who received office, treasure, or a favourable marriage connection entered a relationship of expectation, and royal authority travelled through those personal bonds. The Danish inlets lie beneath pale summer light, even when the air remains cool. Reeds lean over shallow water, and the polished sides of longships reflect broken bands of grey and green. The smell of tar comes from the shipyards, mingling with wet timber and the faint sweetness of drying grain. In the Danish harbours, merchants and envoys could meet beneath the protection of a king whose interests extended across several coasts. Timber hulls arrived from one direction, woven cloth from another, and iron, amber, hides, wax, and grain moved between regions that were politically separate but commercially familiar with one another. Cnut's authority, therefore, depended upon control of major ports and waterways. A port was a place where ships could be gathered, taxes collected, messages exchanged, and loyalties tested. A waterway was both a route of wealth and a route by which the king could appear quickly when a local ruler threatened to withdraw obedience. Taxation supported the machinery of this power. In England, the memory of the great payment known as the Geld remained connected to the costs of conquest and government. Across Scandinavia, tribute and royal dues performed related functions, sustaining household retainers, ship crews, officials, and the ceremonies through which kingship became visible. A narrow channel opens between low shores, and your vessel moves into quieter water. The oars dip with a measured rhythm, their blades entering the sea with a soft wooden sound. Leather rigging shifts above you, and a loose line taps against the mast whenever the hull turns with the current. The kingdom that Cnut ruled was not governed according to one uniform system. England retained its own laws, customs, shires, and political communities, while Denmark preserved its own traditions of assembly, local authority, and royal expectation. Norway possessed yet another political landscape, shaped by long coastlines, regional rulers, mountain valleys, and communities accustomed to considerable local independence. The realm was therefore a connected federation of royal interests rather than a centrally administered state. The modern term North Sea Empire describes this arrangement conveniently, but it was not a standard contemporary title used by Cnut or his subjects. It is a later historical description for a network that depended upon personal rule more than institutional unity. The king's household formed one of the moving centers of this network. Wherever Cnut traveled, the royal court carried records, treasure, religious objects, weapons, servants, interpreters, and men whose loyalty had been formed through service. Authority was not left behind in a palace, because the palace itself could be a ship, a hall, or a temporary camp beside an unfamiliar shore. Night gathers over the inlet with almost no sudden change. The last light remains along the western edge of the water, and the exposed rocks take on a muted, bluish color. In the distance, a bell sounds once from a settlement, then disappears into the soft movement of wind among the reeds. By the middle of the 1020s, Cnut's position in Scandinavia was challenged by King Olaf II of Norway and his Swedish allies. Olaf, known in later tradition as Saint Olaf, had ruled Norway since 1015 and worked to strengthen royal control over a difficult and varied kingdom. His supporters saw a determined Christian king, while his enemies regarded his methods as forceful and intrusive. Cnut's response required more than a claim of inheritance or a display of English wealth. He had to use the sea, the principal instrument of his power, to challenge Olaf's alliances and demonstrate that the Danish and English king could act in Scandinavian waters. The struggle culminated in the Battle of the Helgier in 1026. The location and details of the battle are discussed in Scandinavian sources, and the surviving accounts do not provide every element with complete certainty. It is generally associated with a waterway called Helgier, often connected with eastern Sweden, although the precise setting and sequence of events remain subjects of historical discussion. What matters most for the wider story is the political result. Cnut defeated Olaf II and his Swedish allies at Helgier in 1026. The victory weakened Olaf's position and strengthened Cnut's influence among Norwegian and Swedish elites, showing that the balance of power had shifted towards the king, who could draw upon English resources and Danish naval strength. Water lies black beneath a sky without stars, and the boat rests lightly against its moorings. The carved prow is wet with salt spray, its painted lines softened by years of travel. Nearby, oars lean against a wall, while leather rigging gives a faint creak whenever the breeze crosses the harbour. The battle did not instantly turn Norway into a quiet possession. Victory at sea could remove a rival, but it could not erase local customs, family loyalties, or the habits of communities separated by mountains and long stretches of coast. Cnut still needed agreements, appointments, and representatives to exercise the authority won by his fleet. Olaf's defeat opened the way for Cnut to become King of Norway in 1028. The conquest was supported by naval force, political negotiation, and the willingness of Norwegian rulers to accept a new arrangement. The king's power was greatest where it could be connected to established local leaders, ports, and routes of communication. Norwegian rule was exercised partly through regional rulers and appointed officials. Cnut could not remain in every valley, fjord, and coastal settlement, so authority passed through men who governed on his behalf. Their success depended upon local knowledge, military support, and the ability to appear legitimate within communities that held their own memories of earlier kings. Ælfgifu of Northampton and their son, Svein, governed Norway on Cnut's behalf for a period. Their administration represented the practical difficulty of maintaining a distant kingdom through members of the royal family and trusted supporters. The arrangement also revealed a difference between possessing a crown and commanding the habits of a people. You are standing where the Norwegian shore rises sharply from the water and cold air descends from the mountain valleys. The smell of pine comes down with it, mixed with wet stone, smoke from a distant hearth, and the bitter freshness of deep water. Above the landing place, narrow paths vanish into shadow. Norwegian resistance later drove Ælfgifu and Svein from power. Their removal demonstrated that Cnut's realm remained dependent upon consent, accommodation, and the careful distribution of favor. Representative might carry the king's authority, yet still lack the personal relationships that enabled a ruler to command obedience during hardship. The episode also shows why Cnut's empire cannot be understood as a centralized state in the later sense. There was no permanent bureaucracy extending evenly from England to Norway, no single administrative language controlling every region, and no uniform structure capable of replacing the king's personal presence. Cnut's authority reached its greatest extent in the late 1020s and early 1030s. His realm included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of southern Sweden, while his political influence reached wider areas of Sweden and the lands around the North Sea. Alliances and forms of overlordship also touched regions of northern Germany and Scotland. These connections did not all possess the same strength. Some were direct royal possessions, some rested upon tribute, and others depended upon alliances between rulers or recognition of Cnut's superior status. A king might accept Cnut's friendship, send payment, marry into a connected family, or acknowledge his authority without becoming part of a single administered kingdom. Mist hangs above the Norwegian water, making the far shore appear to float between sea and cloud. Timber hulls stand in rows along the beach, their surfaces dark with moisture. From the valley comes the faint sound of running water, and the harbour stones remain cold beneath your feet. Scotland entered Cnut's wider political horizon through alliances and overlordship, although the nature and extent of that relationship varied according to the rulers involved. Northern Germany likewise lay within the sphere formed by Danish power, commercial routes, dynastic contacts, and the pressure exerted by a king whose fleets could reach many shores. The political map was therefore layered rather than simple. A place could be inside Cnut's realm in one sense, connected to it by tribute in another, and independent in its local law and daily government. The words kingdom, alliance, overlordship, and influence overlapped across the northern seas. This flexible arrangement allowed Cnut to project power over a wide area without replacing every local institution. It also made the empire vulnerable when the king was absent, when representatives were unpopular, or when rival claimants could offer a different focus for loyalty. The structure expanded quickly because it was adaptable and remained delicate for the same reason. Ships gave the system its shape. Fleets carried the king from one political center to another, delivered soldiers to threatened harbors, and brought tribute back across the water. The movement of vessels made distance manageable, although weather, currents, winter darkness, and uncertain local support could still alter the outcome of a campaign. A harbor crowded with foreign tongues would have reflected the diversity of the network. Danish, English, Norwegian, and Swedish speech could mingle with the voices of merchants from the German coast and beyond. Timber hulls would stand close together, their cargoes hidden beneath covers, while interpreters moved between the quays. The same wind that carried a royal message could also delay it for weeks. A ship leaving England might find clear weather in the Channel and contrary winds north of the Danish coast. A fleet gathering in a Norwegian fjord could be trapped by storms, while a rival ruler used the silence to strengthen his position. This dependence upon the sea gave Cnut enormous reach, but it also placed limits upon his command. A king who ruled from the deck of a ship could arrive with impressive speed, yet the strength of his authority depended on whether local communities believed that the fleet would return after the immediate crisis had passed. The North Sea was an instrument of unity, although it was never a calm or obedient one. Its waters joined England with Denmark and Norway more efficiently than many overland routes, but they also separated communities through storms, distance, and sudden isolation. The empire existed through this tension between connection and separation. Low clouds pass over the water, leaving the shore beneath a colorless light. A gull circles above the outer pier, and the sound of its call is carried inland before fading. Along the quay, wet rope lies in loose coils, rough beneath your hand and heavy with the smell of tar. Cnut's relationships with Scandinavian nobles sustained the political structure after conquest. Tribute made submission material, appointments made it visible, and marriage alliances gave it a place within the future of ruling families. Each bond carried its own expectations, and every expectation required maintenance. A noble who served Cnut could gain wealth and status, but also risk the resentment of neighbors who preferred another ruler. A regional official could benefit from royal protection while becoming dependent upon a distant court. A marriage could link two dynasties, yet could not guarantee agreement when inheritance or local custom became contested. The king's personal loyalty was therefore central. Men who had fought with Cnut, received land from him, or shared the risks of his campaigns might remain dependable across several kingdoms. Their allegiance was strengthened by reward, reputation, and the knowledge that their fortunes were tied to the king's continued success. Taxation provided another strand. Payments from England helped finance the ships and retainers that supported Cnut's Scandinavian ambitions. Tribute from Denmark and Norway reinforced the prestige of the crown, while the distribution of wealth allowed the king to sustain relationships with men whose support could not be maintained by words alone. Wood smoke drifts over the harbor, thinning as it reaches the sea. Beneath the pier, water lifts fragments of reed and carries them into the darkness. A sailor adjusts a leather strap near the mast, and the rigging answers with a low, fibrous groan. The empire's separate kingdoms retained their own laws, customs, and local political communities. English shires continued to function through established forms, Danish assemblies preserved their importance, and Norwegian regions remained shaped by local leaders and long-standing patterns of authority. Cnut's kingship did not erase these differences. It rested above them, connecting them through the person of the ruler and the obligations attached to his office. In one place, the king might appear as a Christian monarch supported by bishops and written law, while elsewhere his authority might be expressed through tribute, a ship levy, or an alliance with a powerful family. This was a form of rule suited to an age when royal power traveled with the court. A king's presence could renew old agreements, settle disputes, distribute gifts, and remind local rulers that the wider network still existed. His absence could expose the weaknesses hidden beneath apparent unity. Cnut's travels between his kingdoms were therefore political acts as much as journeys. Each landing displayed his ability to move through the realm he claimed. Each fleet gave form to an otherwise invisible connection. Each royal assembly gathered separate communities around a temporary center. The center of power moved because the empire had no single compact heart. Winchester, Roskilde, Trondheim, and other royal sites could each become important, but none alone represented the whole structure. The empire was a chain of places joined by roots, obligations, and memories of the king's intervention. Along a sheltered Danish inlet, summer light lingers on the water long after the sun has lowered. The banks are quiet beneath grasses and low shrubs, while insects move above the surface in small, wavering clouds. You hear the gentle knock of a loose oar against the side of a boat. In England, Cnut's authority remained rooted in the conquest that had placed him upon the throne. In Denmark, it rested upon dynastic inheritance and maritime strength. In Norway, it depended more visibly upon conquest, representatives, and the cooperation of regional rulers. These different foundations could coexist because Cnut was able to present himself differently in each political landscape. He could be the English king, the Danish king, or the Norwegian king, while also appearing as the ruler who linked the three realms through his household and fleets. The modern phrase North Sea Empire captures the broad shape of this achievement, though people of the 11th century would have understood it through kingship, tribute, family, and allegiance rather than through a fixed imperial label. Cnut's subjects lived within particular kingdoms, and their daily obligations remained local even when the crown's ambitions were wide. His realm included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of southern Sweden, with influence extending into other areas. The boundaries were not drawn as firm lines upon a modern map. They shifted according to military success, political confidence, marriage, payment, and the willingness of local rulers to recognize Cnut's supremacy. A colder breeze moves down from the north, carrying the mineral scent of the open sea. The harbor fires burn lower, and their reflections break apart whenever a wave passes beneath the boats. Far across the water, a single lantern moves slowly along the deck of a departing vessel. The Battle of Helgier in 1026 had shown the importance of naval strength, but it had not transformed the northern world into a settled possession. Cnut still had to negotiate with men who understood the sea, the coastline, and the limits of royal ambition better than any distant official could. His victory over Olaf II and the Swedish allies who supported him gave Cnut a decisive advantage. It helped create the conditions for his accession as King of Norway in 1028 and allowed him to claim a position of unusual strength across the Scandinavian world. Norwegian rule under Cnut was exercised partly through regional rulers and appointed officials because the geography of the kingdom demanded delegation. Narrow valleys, high mountains, island chains, and scattered settlements made continuous supervision impossible. The king's representative could govern a region, but could not become the king in every local memory. Aelfjafu of Northampton and their son Svein carried this burden for a period. Their authority depended upon Cnut's name, the resources attached to it, and the cooperation of Norwegian elites. When resistance later forced them from power, the episode revealed the difference between a conquered throne and a durable political settlement. No empire resting on personal allegiance could be entirely secure. Its strength came from the ruler's ability to reward, threaten, travel, appoint, and reconcile. Its weakness appeared whenever those actions could not reach a distant shore quickly enough, or whenever local communities decided that another arrangement suited them better. The tide withdraws from the mudflats, leaving narrow streams that gleam beneath the moon. Small shells remain among the stones, and the wet ground reflects fragments of cloud. From a moored ship comes the faint smell of pitch, while the ropes sway almost imperceptibly in the night wind. Cnut's power relied upon ships, taxation, personal loyalty, and control of major ports and waterways. Each element supported the others. Ships required revenue, revenue required authority, authority depended upon loyal men, and loyal men were often secured through access to wealth moving through ports. The structure was neither fragile in every moment nor permanent in its design. It could hold together across great distances while Cnut lived, traveled, and distributed favor. It could also change quickly when a representative failed, a rival emerged, or the succession became uncertain after the king's death in 1035. The political center remained mobile, and that mobility was itself a source of strength. Cnut could cross the North Sea to appear in Denmark, send a fleet towards Norway, or receive envoys from Scotland and northern Germany. His authority was made visible through movement, even while the realm's communities remained rooted in their own landscapes. Across the sea lanes, a message could travel more efficiently than it might have done overland. A royal order placed aboard a fast vessel could pass from an English harbour towards Denmark, where it might be received by nobles connected through tribute or marriage. Another ship could carry the answer northward, linking the Danish court to Norway. The same water made the kingdom's neighbours in political time, even when they were distant in physical space. News of a death, rebellion, alliance, or military gathering could move along the coast faster than any ruler could march. A North Sea king therefore ruled not only territory, but also information and expectation. Pale light returns over the Danish inlets, turning the horizon the colour of ash. The water settles into long, shallow folds, and the carved prow before you points towards the open channel. Oars rest inside the vessel, their handles smooth from the hands of many crews. By the late 1020s and early 1030s, Cnut's authority had reached its greatest extent. England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of southern Sweden stood within the main pattern of his rule, while Scotland, northern Germany, wider Swedish regions, and the lands around the North Sea were touched by alliances or overlordship. This was a remarkable concentration of royal power for the 11th century. It united regions with separate languages, laws, economies, and political traditions, yet did so through a common dependence upon the sea. The water between the kingdoms became the means by which they could be imagined as one realm. Still, the empire was not a uniform state. It was a connected federation of royal interests, held together by Cnut's household, ships, tribute, appointments, taxation, and personal reputation. Its unity was real, but it was a unity of relationships rather than administration. The distinction matters because the strength of such a realm could not be measured only by the color of a map. A region might be loyal because its ruler valued Cnut's friendship, because tribute was less costly than resistance, or because a marriage had joined its leading family to the royal household. Each reason could endure, but none was guaranteed to remain unchanged. Cold air crosses the harbour from the Norwegian mountain valleys, moving over the dark water and into the spaces between the houses. A wooden door closes somewhere beyond the quay. The sound is brief, and the surrounding silence gathers around it without disturbance. Cnut's empire also depended upon the memory of successful action. The defeat of Olaf II at Helgea, the accession to Norway in 1028, and the continued possession of Denmark after 1019 all formed part of a reputation that travelled ahead of the king. A reputation could persuade a local ruler that submission was sensible, a merchant that the harbour was safe, or a noble family that alliance with Cnut would secure its future. It could also discourage challengers who knew that an English fleet might arrive after the first signs of rebellion. Yet reputation required renewal. The king had to appear, reward, listen, punish, and negotiate. A forgotten agreement weakened, a delayed payment caused irritation, and an unpopular official could turn an entire region against the authority he represented. Norway made these limits especially clear. Its coastal routes allowed ships to move between settlements, but the interior remained divided by terrain. A ruler governing through Ælfjafu and Svein could maintain influence over major centers, yet still face resistance from men whose loyalty was attached to local communities and older traditions. In Denmark, Cnut's position was stronger because the kingdom gave him a strategic base across the North Sea and Baltic approaches. Danish waters connected the royal network towards Sweden, the German coast, and Norway, while Danish nobles provided relationships that could sustain influence beyond the immediate reach of the king's household. You stand beside a jetty built from rough planks, each surface polished by rain and footsteps. The timber smells of salt and smoke, and cool water laps below the gaps. Somewhere behind the warehouses, a horse shifts in its stall, disturbing a chain. The Northern Empire was therefore shaped by several kinds of distance. England and Denmark were separated by open sea, Norway stretched along a difficult coast, and Sweden entered the picture through regions that could not always be governed by a single command. The wider lands of Scotland and northern Germany lay within overlapping spheres of interest. Cnut's strength came from making these distances useful. Ships transformed separation into a route, ports became meeting places, and tribute converted political recognition into material support. The sea did not erase geography, but it allowed the king to work with it. The North Sea connected the principal territories more efficiently than overland routes would have done. That efficiency was relative, not absolute, and every voyage remained at the mercy of wind and weather. Even so, the water provided a natural corridor along which fleets, messages, wealth, and dynastic claims could circulate. Cnut traveled between his kingdoms and used fleets to project authority. His movement showed that the empire was not an abstract collection of lands, but a practical network maintained by the arrival of ships and the presence of men who carried the king's orders. When the fleet departed, the harbor would gradually become ordinary again. Foreign tongues would thin, royal banners would vanish beyond the headland, and local business would resume beneath the same roofs. The wider empire would remain present in taxes, appointments, memories, and the possibility of another royal arrival. Mist gathers where the inlet opens into the sea, softening the outline of distant islands. The last birds settle among the reeds, and the creak of leather rigging sounds almost like a breath. Beneath the hull, the tide turns slowly, carrying the vessel towards the outer water. Cnut's North Sea realm was enormous, but its enormity did not make it solid. It was stretched across cold waters, held by the repeated tension of loyalty and reward. England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of southern Sweden were connected, yet remained distinct political communities. The empire touched northern Germany and Scotland through alliances and overlordship, while broader Swedish regions and the lands around the North Sea felt the pressure of Cnut's authority. These connections enlarged the king's influence without transforming every neighboring territory into a directly ruled province. The arrangement depended upon the ruler's ability to remain at the center of many relationships at once. Cnut had to be king of England, king of Denmark, king of Norway, and a recognized power among Scandinavian nobles. He had to preserve the maritime routes that allowed these roles to communicate with one another. His authority reached its greatest extent in the late 1020s and early 1030s, when the memory of Helgia remained strong and Norway had been brought beneath his crown. The moment was powerful precisely because it rested upon circumstances that could change. A distant fire glimmers along the shore, reflected in a broken line upon the water. The air has grown colder, and the salt on your face feels dry beneath the touch of the wind. Around you, the timber hulls rise and fall together, each vessel following the same tide. The death of Cnut in 1035 would expose the difficulty of passing such a personal structure into the hands of successors. The empire had not been built as a machine that could operate independently of its maker. It had been assembled through conquest, marriage, appointment, taxation, tribute, and the daily practice of royal presence. For the years of Cnut's rule, Denmark remained a strategic base, Norway remained a hard-won kingdom, and England remained the western foundation of his kingship. The North Sea allowed these territories to exist within a single political imagination, even though their laws, customs, and local communities stayed separate. The term North Sea Empire remains useful because it describes the pattern formed by those connections. It suggests movement, maritime power, and a realm whose parts were joined by water rather than by roads across one continuous interior. It also reminds us that empire can exist through influence and allegiance, not only through central offices and permanent garrisons. Cnut's achievement was thus both broad and delicate. He proved that a king could govern across the North Sea, use fleets to project authority, and draw distant kingdoms into a network of common interest. He also revealed how much such a network depended upon the person who held its separate strands. The final darkness settles over the harbor, leaving only the pale line of water beyond the pier. The carved ship's prow remains wet with salt spray, and the rigging shifts gently above the sleeping deck. Across the Northern Sea, England, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden lie beneath the same wind. You are standing beside that quiet water while distant ports rest beyond the horizon. The cold air from the Norwegian valleys, the pale light of the Danish inlets, and the creak of oars belong to one wide northern landscape. The sea lanes remain open, though no vessel can be seen. Cnut's empire has become an image of a political web stretched across cold northern waters. Its threads run through ships, taxes, ports, marriage alliances, regional rulers, and the private loyalties of men who served a traveling king. Each strand reaches towards another shore, and each depends upon the strength of the whole. No single road leads through this realm, and no single city contains it. The kingdoms retain their own identities, while the North Sea joins them through movement and memory. For time, Cnut's authority makes the distance between them seem smaller than it truly is. The tide carries a faint sound from the outer water, perhaps a wave against a hull, perhaps the movement of a departing boat. The harbor remains still beneath the dark sky. Beyond it, the great network of Cnut's rule rests upon its waters, wide, intricate, and quietly uncertain. You are standing in a chamber at Winchester, where candlelight rests upon the pale grain of a wooden table and winter air presses quietly against the shutters. Emma of Normandy sits near the fire, wrapped in dark wool, with gold thread glimmering faintly at her sleeves. Around her, clerks bend over parchment, their quills moving softly through the stillness. The stone floor remains cool beneath traveling feet, even after many hours of royal activity. Beyond the chamber, river mist gathers around Winchester, drifting between walls, gardens, and the distant roofs of churches. The scent of incense rises beneath a nearby timber church roof, mingling with beeswax, smoke, and the faint odor of damp rushes. A servant carries a covered lamp across the doorway, its light moving over silver vessels, folded cloth, and the quiet faces of those waiting upon the Queen. Emma was the daughter of Richard I of Normandy and Gunora, born into a family whose influence extended across the narrow waters between Normandy and England. Her childhood belonged to a world of crossings, alliances, and carefully remembered descent. Normandy was not merely the place of her birth, but the inheritance carried in her name. Her father, Richard I, had strengthened the authority of the Norman ruling house, while her mother, Gunora, belonged to a family whose connections reached deeply into the aristocracy of northern France. Through them, Emma received the weight of a lineage that could be carried into another kingdom. Around 1002, Emma married Ethelred Roman II, King of England. The union joined a Norman princess to the English royal house at a time when Scandinavian attacks had made the future of the kingdom uncertain. Ethelred's realm possessed old institutions, ancient claims, and a Christian monarchy whose authority rested upon ancestry as much as military strength. Emma entered that world as both foreign bride and royal partner. You are seated now beside a narrow window, with the darkness of the courtyard below and the warm breath of the fire moving across your face. A loose parchment lies beneath your hand, its surface slightly ridged where the fibers have dried. The clerk's ink shines when the candle flame leans towards it, then fades to brown as the light withdraws. Outside, rain touches the timber awnings with quiet, irregular tapping. Somewhere beyond the walls, a horse shifts in its stall, and leather tack gives a subdued creak. The chamber smells of ash, wool, damp stone, and the resinous smoke of a torch burning in the passage. On a nearby chest, a folded veil rests beside a small reliquary, while a strip of blue cloth catches the firelight like a fragment of evening sky. Emma was Queen of England from 1002 until 1016, except during Sweyn Forkbeard's brief rule. Her queenship unfolded during years of invasion, tribute, rebellion, and shifting allegiance. The title did not guarantee safety, and royal marriage did not erase the violence pressing against the kingdom. Emma's position, nevertheless, gave her a place within the English court, where her presence connected the ruling house of Normandy to the descendants of Alfred the Great. The court itself moved between settlements, and each arrival required the renewal of ceremony, hospitality, and written authority. Sweyn Forkbeard's conquest interrupted Ethelred's rule and placed Emma within a rapidly changing political landscape. Sweyn's brief reign revealed how quickly a kingdom could be transferred when military power, aristocratic support, and royal reputation converged. After Sweyn's death, Ethelred returned, but the memory of conquest remained close to the surface. Emma's marriage had begun as an alliance with Normandy, yet England's future was increasingly entangled with Denmark. The room grows quieter as night deepens, and the fire settles into a bed of red coals. You can feel the warmth fading from the nearer stones, while the far side of the chamber retains the damp chill of the outer air. A narrow thread of smoke descends from the rafters before finding its way towards the chimney. The rushes beneath your feet are dry in some places and flattened in others, carrying traces of crushed herbs, mud, and old straw. From the church beyond the courtyard comes the faintest movement of sound, perhaps a bell rope settling after evening prayers. River mist hangs around Winchester, whitening the low ground and softening the outlines of walls. In the uncertain candlelight, a manuscript image waits unopened, its gold thread hidden beneath a protective covering. In 1016, Cnut took control of England after Ethelred's death and the defeat of Edmund Ironside. The conquest created a new problem for Emma because the victor could not simply destroy every connection to the previous royal family. England required continuity as well as command. Cnut therefore married Emma in 1017 after taking control of the kingdom. Their marriage joined Cnut to the previous English royal family, giving his new rule a relationship with the dynasty that had governed England before the Danish conquest. This settlement carried personal and dynastic consequences. Emma became the conqueror's wife while remaining Ethelred's widow, and her body, memory, and household became part of the argument for a stable succession. Cnut gained more than a queen from Normandy. He acquired a living connection to the English royal line, while Emma gained a place beside the ruler whose authority had transformed the island. You're walking slowly through a cloistered passage, where stone floors cool beneath travelling feet and the walls hold the day's remaining warmth. Each step produces a small hollow sound, softened by hanging cloth and the uneven surface of the paving. At the end of the passage, incense forms a pale ribbon in the lamplight. Wax has fallen in small hardened pools beside the altar, and a priest's sandals leave faint marks in the dust. The air carries the fragrance of myrrh, old wood, wet wool, and extinguished tallow. Rainwater slips from the eaves into a courtyard basin, where the surface trembles whenever a drop reaches it. Through an open arch, you see river mist surrounding Winchester, turning distant buildings into grey shapes without clear edges. Cnut's marriage to Emma made succession politics a matter of competing maternal and paternal lines. The children of Emma's first marriage remained important because Ethelred had been king before Cnut. Emma and Ethelred had produced Edward the Confessor and Aelfrid Etheling, sons whose royal blood connected them to the English line and to the memory of their father. Cnut and Emma's son, Harthacnut, was born around 1018 or 1019, and his claim carried both Danish and English associations. Harthacnut's position rested upon his paternal descent from Cnut and his maternal descent from Emma. Edward and Aelfrid, by contrast, represented the earlier royal family through both parents, though their years away from England shaped how their claims could be used. The succession was therefore not a simple matter of birth order. It became a field of maternal inheritance, paternal conquest, household loyalty, and public remembrance. Emma retained a significant political role during and after Cnut's reign. Her authority did not depend only upon formal commands, since queenship operated through access, correspondence, patronage, and the management of dynastic memory. On a table near the wall, soft parchment lies beneath a clerk's hand, weighted at its corners by small stones. The document records a gift, a boundary, or the confirmation of an old right. Its words move in measured lines, while the margins gather tiny stains from wax and fingers. Around you, the room bears the signs of travel. Saddles folded against a pillar, damp cloaks hung near the fire, and a chest marked with the seal of a distant household. A manuscript image has been opened beneath a lamp, and gold thread catches the candlelight where a crown, sleeve, or border has been worked into the page. The gleam disappears whenever a passing figure interrupts the flame. Cnut and Emma presented themselves as Christian rulers, and their public partnership was expressed through church foundations, gifts, charters, and ceremony. The language of Christian kingship offered Cnut a way to transform conquest into order. A ruler who had arrived through warfare needed to appear as a guardian of churches, a protector of law, and a patron of the communities whose prayers supported the kingdom. Emma's presence strengthened this presentation because she belonged to England's established royal world while also connecting the court to Normandy. Together, Cnut and Emma endowed churches and supported religious institutions. Cnut is associated with patronage at Winchester, Canterbury, and elsewhere, where royal gifts could take the form of land, vessels, textiles, books, or privileges confirmed by charter. Such acts were devotional, political, and practical at once. They placed the royal household within the sacred landscape of the kingdom, and allowed the ruler's memory to continue in prayers after his passing. At Canterbury, the air beneath the church roof is heavy with incense and the faint mineral scent of old stone. You stand beside a pillar worn smooth by generations of shoulders, watching candle flames tremble before painted panels. The timber above you is darkened by smoke, and the beams disappear into a shadowed height. A bell sounds somewhere beyond the enclosed courts, its note spreading through the building before dissolving into the wet night. Beneath the arches, embroidered cloth hangs motionless, though a colder current passes close to the floor. The polished surface of a metal vessel reflects a broken line of fire. Outside, rain gathers along the roof edge, falls into the cloister garden, and disappears among the leaves. Cnut's support for religious institutions was part of a broader strategy of legitimacy, in which piety, law, patronage, and marriage reinforced one another. A church received land, and the land carried the king's name into future generations. A written charter confirmed a boundary, and the boundary made royal authority visible in the fields. A pilgrimage placed the monarch among the wider rulers of Christendom. A marriage joined a conquering king to an older dynasty. Each action addressed a different uncertainty, yet all contributed to the same image of rightful rule. Emma understood the value of such connections. Her family remained influential in Normandy, and her position linked England to Normandy through blood, marriage, and correspondence. Norman relatives, English nobles, Danish officials, and churchmen could all understand her household as a point where different political worlds touched. The connection did not remove rivalry, but it gave rivalry a formal language. In the spring of 1027, Cnut traveled to Rome for the imperial coronation of Conrad II. You were traveling with the royal procession along a road bordered by wet fields and low stone walls. The wheels pass through shallow mud, and the horse's breath appears briefly in the cool air. Traveling feet strike stone floors when the company reaches a monastery, carrying road dust into a quiet refectory. Lamps burn before painted saints, and incense rises in slow layers around the royal party. The journey is long, yet its purpose reaches beyond personal devotion. At every stage, the king moves through a network of rulers, bishops, abbots, merchants, and messengers. Cnut's pilgrimage enabled him to meet powerful rulers and ecclesiastical authorities. Rome provided a setting in which the King of England and Denmark could be seen within the wider order of Christian Europe. The journey placed Cnut before the emperor, near the papal court, and among men whose authority extended beyond any single island or northern kingdom. Such meetings could settle disputes, secure recognition, and create the impression of a ruler accepted by the established powers of Christendom. Cnut later described the journey in a letter to the English. The letter presented his Roman experience as part of his concern for good government, rather than as a private adventure distant from the affairs of his kingdoms. He associated kingship with justice, peace, and Christian obligation. The language suggested that authority was not merely possession, but a duty exercised before God and before the people. A pale morning enters through the high windows of Winchester, touching the river mist with a color like watered silver. You are standing near the harbor at dawn, where ropes lie dark with moisture, and the first movement begins among the boats. Merchants unload their cargoes beneath the grey sky, placing folded cloth, barrels, carved objects, and sacks of grain upon the boards. The cold air moves across your face, carrying river water, wet timber, horse sweat, and the distant fragrance of bread. A clerk waits with parchment tucked beneath his arm, while another man measures goods against a wooden tally. The settlement awakens gradually, without sharp division between night and day. Behind the landing place, Winchester's churches rise through the haze like patient guardians of the water. By linking the Roman pilgrimage with the needs of government, Cnut shaped the image of a ruler whose authority was disciplined by Christian responsibility. Emma's own political role continued within this carefully constructed world. She was not a passive ornament beside the king, because access to the queen could direct petitions, preserve relationships, and protect the interests of a household. Her position also allowed competing groups to approach the monarchy through a figure whose lineage made her intelligible to several sides. The marriage with Cnut did not erase Emma's earlier marriage to Ethelred. Instead, both unions remained active in the political imagination. Edward the Confessor and Aelfried Aetheling represented one branch of the royal story, while Harthacnut embodied another. Emma stood at the meeting point, and her survival made the competing lines visible within one person's household. The chamber has been prepared for writing, and the surface of the table feels smooth beneath your fingertips. A knife has trimmed the parchment into a clean rectangle, leaving small curls of pale material near the clerk's elbow. The quill scratches, pauses, and begins again. A seal rests in a shallow dish, its wax still soft enough to hold the impression of a royal emblem. Beside it, a thread of red silk has been wound around a document so that its ends lie neatly together. The fire gives little heat now, though its light travels across the walls in slow orange bands. Somewhere beyond the door, water drips from a cloak onto the stone floor. The smell of incense remains faintly present, woven into the timber and the wool. After Cnut's death in 1035, the arrangement of succession became more unstable, and Emma's position became even more important. Harthacnut was in Denmark, while Harold Harefoot gained authority in England. Emma supported Harthacnut's claim, and the political struggle drew upon the different maternal and paternal lines created by her two royal marriages. Her household became a place where claims were preserved, defended, and interpreted. The memory of Cnut could support Harthacnut, while the memory of Ethelred could support Edward and Aelfried. The years after Cnut's reign showed how fragile legitimacy could become when a powerful ruler disappeared. The kingdom did not contain one uncontested inheritance, because royal descent could be understood through several lines at once. Emma's earlier and later marriages had made her central to this complexity. Her life joined the houses of Normandy, Wessex, and Denmark, but the same connection also made her a focus for rivalry. In the quiet of a monastic library, the pages of an old book rest beneath a cloth cover. You lift the covering and see the parchment glow softly in the candlelight. Gold thread catches the flame in a manuscript image, marking the edge of a crown and the folds of a robe. The colors have softened with age, yet the painted figures remain composed, their faces turned towards one another in silent ceremony. Dust lies within the binding, and the leather smells faintly of oil, smoke, and damp shelves. Beyond the window, the weather has cleared, leaving the courtyard stones dark and reflective. A single bird moves beneath the eaves, while the river mist around Winchester thins above the grass. The encomium Emi Regini was written in 1041 or 1042, probably by a monk connected with Saint Bertin or Saint Thoma. The work was commissioned by Emma and belonged to her political world after Cnut's death. It presented Emma, Cnut, and their family in a strongly favorable light, shaping the past so that the Queen's position appeared dignified, coherent, and defensible. The text offered an account of conquest, marriage, succession, and loyalty, but it did not preserve every part of Emma's earlier history with equal clarity. The encomium omits or reshapes politically inconvenient parts of Emma's earlier life. Its silences and arrangements reveal that historical writing could serve immediate dynastic needs. The past was not treated as a fixed corridor through which every event had to remain visible. It could be furnished, illuminated, and ordered according to the dangers facing the living. The surviving manuscript includes an image of Emma receiving the book. In that scene, the Queen appears not simply as a subject of history, but as the person to whom history is formally presented. A narrow room opens towards the cloister, and the afternoon light falls across the manuscript in a muted golden line. You see the painted Emma receiving the book, while gold thread catches candlelight around the borders and halos of the image. The colors appear warmer than the surrounding parchment, as if the page preserves a small enclosed fire. Soft parchment beneath a clerk's hand bears the pressure of earlier writing, and tiny irregularities rise beneath the ink. The air is still enough for a candle flame to stand nearly upright. From the church comes a distant murmur of voices, blending with the faint movement of robes across stone. The scent of incense has settled into the rafters, where it remains after the prayers have ended. The encomium did more than praise Emma, because it defined the relationships through which her authority could be understood. Cnut appeared as a Christian king whose conquest had been brought into lawful and generous order. Emma appeared as the noble queen who joined dynasties and preserved the dignity of her family. Harthacnut's claim benefited from this arrangement, while Cnut's memory was placed beside that of the English royal house. The narrative did not remove conflict, but it softened the roughest edges through ceremony and praise. For Emma, the book provided a durable form of political presence. Her authority could no longer depend entirely upon a living court, a personal audience, or the movement of messengers. It could also reside in a manuscript held by institutions, read by clerks, and consulted by those who wished to understand the legitimacy of the royal family. The written page became another room in which Emma remained present. Years pass across the manuscript, leaving the gold less bright and the parchment more delicate. You're walking again through Winchester, beneath a sky washed pale after rain. Stone floors remain cool beneath traveling feet as you cross the entrance of a church. The sound of the river is low and distant, hidden behind walls and gardens. Moisture gathers on the edges of carved steps, and the air tastes clean after the weather. A lamp burns beside a doorway, its oil giving off a gentle, familiar smell. Within the church, smoke moves slowly towards the dark beams. Emma's political life continued beyond Cnut's death, although the balance of power around her altered repeatedly. Harthacnut eventually became King of England, and Edward, the Confessor, returned to the kingdom that had been ruled by his father. Emma's children therefore carried separate claims, each strengthened by a different portion of their maternal and paternal inheritance. The Queen's life made the relationship between those claims impossible to ignore. In this continuing uncertainty, legitimacy depended upon more than one kind of evidence. Ancestry mattered, but so did recognition by leading men, support from churches, control of royal resources, and the ability to present a peaceful future. Cnut had used marriage, piety, law, and patronage as parts of a broader strategy of legitimacy. Emma continued to inhabit that strategy, even when the ruler who had shaped it was gone. Toward evening, river mist gathers again around Winchester, softening the outlines of the city. You stand beside a quiet wall where dampness darkens the lower stones. The grass beyond it bends beneath droplets, and the last daylight rests along the reeds near the water. A small boat moves without hurry through the mist, its oar making a muted sound against the river. From the churchyard comes the scent of earth, crushed leaves, and old timber. The air has cooled enough to make the metal of a gate feel sharp beneath your hand. Above the roofs, smoke rises from household fires and joins the grey veil surrounding the city. Emma died in 1052 and was buried at Winchester beside Cnut. The burial brought together two people whose partnership had altered the political shape of northern Europe. Cnut had come to England as a conqueror, then placed himself within the previous royal family through marriage. Emma had entered England as the daughter of Richard, the first of Normandy and Gunora, married Ethelred around 1002, and later became Cnut's wife. Her life crossed the boundaries between Normandy, England, and Denmark. Besides Cnut, Emma remained linked to the king, whose authority she had helped present as lawful, Christian, and enduring. Their resting place did not remove the conflicts that followed their deaths, yet it gave the partnership a final physical form. Stone could hold together what succession politics had divided, just as the manuscript could arrange the past into a story of continuity. The church is nearly dark now, with only a few candles burning along the edges of the nave. You move across the stone floor, cool beneath traveling feet, while the sound of your steps fades into the vaulted distance. Incense lingers lightly beneath the timber roof, no longer rising in thick strands, but remaining as a quiet trace. River mist presses against the outer doors, making the candle flames appear brighter by comparison. A brass vessel reflects a wavering crescent of gold. On a nearby stand, parchment rests beneath a linen cloth, protected from the damp. The room seems to hold both movement and stillness, as though journeys, prayers, and royal ceremonies have settled into the fabric of the walls. The memory of Emma and Cnut survived through burial, charter, church patronage, family claims, and carefully shaped writing. Their story was never only the story of a marriage. It was also the story of how a kingdom learned to describe conquest as inheritance, how a foreign queen became part of an English dynasty, and how royal authority could be made persuasive through several forms at once. Emma's Norman family remained influential across the water, while her children carried the consequences of her two marriages into the future. The encomium preserved one version of that world, favoring Emma and Cnut, while omitting or reshaping difficult episodes. The Roman journey of 1027 placed Cnut among emperors and churchmen, and his letter to the English connected kingship with justice, peace, and Christian obligation. The churches of Winchester, Canterbury, and elsewhere received visible signs of royal devotion. Each act contributed another strand to the fabric of legitimacy. At last, the candles burn low, and the manuscript image fades into the surrounding darkness. You can still distinguish the outline of Emma receiving the book, while gold thread catches candlelight along the edge of the painted scene. The parchment has cooled beneath your hand, though it retains the faint scent of leather, dust, and smoke. Outside, river mist drifts around Winchester, covering the roads and gardens in a quiet veil. Rainwater moves gently along the gutters, and the timber roof answers with an occasional settling sound. Beneath you, the stone floor holds the day's cold. Above, the rafters disappear into shadow, carrying the old fragrance of incense. Emma of Normandy remains beside Cnut in the memory of Winchester, joined in stone after their lives had joined England, Normandy, Denmark, and the competing lines of royal descent. Her first marriage to Ethelred produced Edward the Confessor and Aelfrid Etheling. Her second marriage to Cnut produced Harthacnut around 1018 or 1019. Through Emma, the maternal line became as politically important as the paternal line, and succession became a question of which inheritance could command the greatest recognition. The work of legitimacy continued in every charter, foundation, pilgrimage, and royal burial. It moved through soft parchment beneath a clerk's hand, through incense beneath timber roofs, through the careful placement of a manuscript image, and through the quiet stone where Emma and Cnut were laid together. Their partnership survives there, not as a simple answer to history, but as a patient arrangement of names, places, memories, and claims. Winchester grows still beneath the night, and the river carries the mist onward through the darkness. You stand at the tide line beneath a pale morning sky, where small waves fold over wet sand and withdraw with a soft, measured sound. A wooden chair waits upon the shore, its legs darkened by salt and spray, while the tide gathers beyond it in a broad, shining curve. Around you, the beach is quiet enough to hear the delicate hiss of foam around one wooden leg, followed by the faint creak of timber. You feel the cool air moving across your face, carrying the mineral scent of water and the darker fragrance of wet earth. Behind you, the land rises gently, and beyond the shore, fields and villages rest beneath a calm horizon touched with silver. You are not standing in a moment securely preserved by those who watched it happen, but inside a story shaped by memory. In the 12th century, Henry of Huntingdon recorded the tale of a king who ordered the sea to stop. Henry wrote generations after Cnut's death, when the old Northern Empire had already passed into history and legend. You hear the story as a later moralizing account, carefully arranged to teach that royal power, however impressive, ends where the natural world begins. The tale places Cnut upon a throne carried down to the tide line, where his courtiers gather around him beneath the open sky. You see the bearers lower the throne onto the damp sand, while the king's robes settle heavily around his feet. The sea continues its patient movement, advancing by small degrees across the shore, without haste and without hesitation. Cnut commands the incoming tide to halt, and for a while the command hangs over the water like a solemn word. No wave answers him, and no hidden force bends the horizon towards the wishes of a human court. The water continues to rise, reaching the chair legs, darkening the wood, and spreading in thin sheets across the sand. Foam curls around the timber, then slips away, leaving tiny bubbles trembling in the hollows between the grains. You remain beside the shore as the tide advances, watching nature preserve its own quiet authority beneath the king's outstretched hand. The sound is neither dramatic nor violent, for the sea does not need anger to refuse a command. Each small wave folds over wet sand with the same ancient motion, and each retreat leaves the beach slightly changed. Henry of Huntingdon's story gives Cnut a throne at the edge of the world, where political ceremony meets the ordinary movement of water. You imagine the courtiers standing behind him, their fine garments stirring in the sea wind as the tide passes beneath the royal seat. The king then uses this failure to teach his courtiers that no earthly ruler commands the sea. His lesson is simple, though the scene has gathered many centuries around it, like sediment around a stone. The episode is best treated as a later moralizing story about royal limits, rather than as a securely attested event from Cnut's reign. You let the account remain in that gentle uncertainty, neither discarding its meaning nor mistaking its literary form for direct testimony. The tide rises because the moon and the coast permit it, because wind and depth and distance shape its movement beyond any crown. A king may command ships, armies, taxes, marriages, and laws, yet the water keeps its own measure beneath the changing light. The shore grows brighter as morning develops, and the edge of the sea turns from grey to blue, then back towards green. You hear gulls somewhere beyond the dunes, though their cries arrive softened by the spaciousness of the coast. A thin veil of cloud moves over the sun, and the wet sand briefly loses its brightness beneath a colour like brushed pewter. The chair remains close to the advancing water, its carved arms catching small beads of spray that glimmer and disappear. Salt gathers along the grain of the wood, while loose strands of seaweed lie twisted nearby in dark, delicate ropes. Your feet are planted in cool sand that yields slightly beneath your weight, holding the shape of each step for a little while. The horizon is broad and empty, without towers, banners, or watchmen, and the sea seems to continue beyond the reach of sight. A low wind passes over the surface, pressing small ripples into the water and sending a faint shiver through the grasses behind you. The world around the tide line is made of modest sounds, with water, wind, distant birds, and the occasional tapping of a shell. Nothing urges the moment forwards, and the rising tide follows its slow pattern beneath the quieting sky. You think of the king's lesson not as humiliation, but as a carefully chosen image of proportion. Cnut had exercised immense power across the northern seas, yet the story places him before water that acknowledges no master. You follow the shape of his reign back through the years, beginning in England in 1016, when Conquest brought him to the throne. By 1019, you find him established as King of Denmark, linking the English kingdom to the lands across the North Sea. In 1028, you see his authority extend into Norway, creating the political structure later remembered as the North Sea Empire. From 1028 until 1035, Cnut ruled Norway, while England remained under his rule from 1016 until 1035. Denmark also remained within his dominion from 1019 until 1035, and the three kingdoms moved within the orbit of one king. You imagine the distances involved, the wide water between courts, the seasons of sailing, and the long messages carried by ship and rider. Political power in that world traveled by sea, but it depended upon people who could cross the water, read the weather, and keep faith with distant authority. The empire was never a single block of land joined by roads, for its parts rested along coasts, islands, rivers, and difficult northern routes. You see royal ships leaving a harbour beneath morning mist, their oars entering the water in a steady rhythm. Ropes creak against wooden posts, cargo shifts within the hulls, and the smell of tar lies thick around the quayside. Merchants unload wool, grain, timber, iron, wax, and salted fish, while sailors carry news from one shore to another. The sea is a road, a barrier, a source of wealth, and a reminder that every connection can loosen with distance. Cnut's authority required more than victory in battle, because conquest alone could not keep England, Denmark, and Norway aligned. You watch him use Christian kingship, dynastic marriage, patronage, ceremony, and the language of order to make his rule appear settled. His marriage to Emma joined him to an established English royal line and strengthened the legitimacy of his position. Christian institutions gave his authority a sacred vocabulary, while royal burial, pilgrimage, and gifts to churches gave that vocabulary visible form. The king could be presented as conqueror, protector, husband, patron, and Christian ruler, depending upon the place and the audience. You move between these identities as quietly as a ship moves between headlands, each one contributing to the memory of Cnut. In England, the conquered king had to become more than a foreign warlord, and his rule needed to be woven into existing traditions. In Denmark, he belonged to the northern world from which his power had grown, while Norway tested the limits of distant kingship. The same crown could look different from each shore, reflecting local customs, memories, and expectations among the local elites. You hear the tide beyond the harbour, where waves strike the pilings with a slow, hollow rhythm beneath the voices of men. A merchant's lantern remains lit beside a warehouse door, its flame trembling whenever the wind enters through gaps in the boards. The morning carries the smell of damp rope and crushed shells, with smoke from a distant hearth drifting low across the water. Dark birds settle upon the roofline, shaking their feathers against the coolness that lingers after the night. Stones beneath your feet are uneven and polished by years of rain, carts, boots, and the slow reach of salt water. Along the quay, a coil of hemp rests beside a wooden bucket filled with rain, its surface disturbed by tiny falling drops. The tide lifts against the harbour wall and pauses there, shining between the stones before slipping back into the channel. Beyond the vessels, the sea holds a long grey pathway towards Denmark, Norway, and the scattered settlements of the northern coast. You can feel how much a kingdom depends upon movement, and how much movement depends upon weather, wood, patience, and trust. Cnut's empire appeared durable because his personal authority was unusually strong, but its foundations were still human and therefore fragile. He could distribute land, appoint officials, reward companions, and settle rival claims, yet he could not give equal strength to every distant shore. The story of the tide, therefore, becomes a fitting reflection on the difference between command and control. A ruler may order the movement of people, but the sea answers to seasons, currents, storms, and the pull of the moon. You return to the throne at the water's edge, where the courtiers stand close enough to hear the foam passing around the legs. Perhaps the king's lesson was meant to soften pride, or perhaps later generations needed a memorable image for the limits of kingship. Either way, the tale preserves a truth about Cnut's memory, even though it does not securely preserve a fact about his life. The written story comes late, and its purpose is moral, yet its setting remains wonderfully clear in the imagination. You see the king surrounded by attendants, the sea before him, and the broad authority of nature moving without ceremony. The court waits in silence, while the water rises by another finger's breadth, and the chair settles more deeply into the sand. A sleeve brushes against the wooden arm, a cloak darkens at the hem, and a line of foam breaks beneath the throne. The courtiers understand that the order has failed, though the sea makes no announcement and offers no explanation. Cnut's authority has not vanished, but its proper boundary has appeared, drawn in water across the shore. A king can rule a kingdom, yet he remains a person beneath the sky, standing upon ground that will not obey forever. The lesson travels easily, because it requires no battlefield, no treaty, and no account of political complexity. It needs only a throne, a tide, a command, and the patient refusal of the natural world. By afternoon, the sea wind has strengthened, moving coldly across the dunes and carrying fine grains of sand against your boots. Small waves fold over wet sand in overlapping crescents, their edges bright where daylight catches the foam. The old chair has been drawn higher above the water, leaving a dark rectangular mark where its legs pressed into the beach. At the margin of the retreating tide, delicate trails reveal the movements of tiny creatures beneath the surface. A strand of kelp lies across the sand like a green-black ribbon, glossy on one side and rough upon the other. Near the dunes, coarse grass bends and rises again, making a dry whisper that continues even when the water falls quiet. The air tastes faintly of salt, and the distant horizon carries a hazy line where sea and sky become almost indistinguishable. Clouds gather towards evening, giving the water a darker tone that deepens beneath the first shadows of night. You remain within the broad silence, feeling time pass through changes in light rather than through any visible clock. Cnut's final years were shaped by the effort to keep separate kingdoms within one political arrangement, and by the knowledge that succession would matter. His sons held claims, his allies had interests, and the loyalties of each region depended upon more than the memory of conquest. When Cnut died at Shaftesbury on 12 November 1035, the empire lost the person who had joined its parts together. You picture Shaftesbury in November, with the darkening sky over Wessex and the roads softened by rain. The royal household moves through rooms warmed by fire, while outside, bare branches stir above the wet ground. Cnut's death came not at the edge of a battlefield, but within the ordinary stillness of an English autumn. He had ruled England from 1016 until 1035, Denmark from 1019 until 1035, and Norway from 1028 until 1035. Those dates form a quiet frame around his reign, extending across 19 years in England, 16 in Denmark, and 7 in Norway. You hear the names of the kingdoms as though they were distant bells, each sounding from a different shore. England, Denmark, and Norway had been connected by one king, but they had not become a single country. Their unity depended upon traveling courts, trusted officials, family alliances, naval strength, and continued recognition of Cnut's authority. After Cnut's death, his sons competed over the succession, and the old arrangement began to loosen along its sea routes. You enter the cold evening at Shaftesbury, where rain darkens the timber outside, and the household's voices become subdued. Candles burn in narrow holders, casting wavering light upon plastered walls, wooden chests, and the quiet faces of those gathered indoors. Wet wool gives off a faint animal smell, mingling with smoke, beeswax, and the earthy scent carried in from the road. Beyond the walls, the November air presses against shutters and sends a thin draught beneath the door. The sky over Wessex darkens early, turning the last light above the fields into a muted band of blue-grey. Drops gather along the eaves and fall at irregular intervals, striking the packed ground beside the house. A horse shifts in its stall, leather creaks softly, and somewhere nearby a fire settles with a low collapse of embers. The household keeps watch through the evening, surrounded by the ordinary textures of stone, wool, wood, ash, and rain. No sea lies directly beyond the walls, yet the fate of the northern waters has arrived within this quiet inland place. Cnut was buried at Winchester, where his body entered the stone memory of the English kingdom he had ruled. You follow the funeral procession through damp streets, beneath a sky that remains heavy with November cloud. The bier moves slowly towards the church, and the sound of footsteps travels between walls darkened by rain. At Winchester, candlelight beside a stone tomb draws small circles of gold across the floor and leaves the higher arches in shadow. The burial joins Cnut to the place where English kings had long been remembered, even though his power had reached far across the North Sea. The tomb gives the dead king a fixed center, while his former empire remains stretched between shores, islands, and changing loyalties. You stand near the stone and smell wax, cold mortar, damp cloth, and faint incense lingering beneath the roof. Flames bend whenever a door opens, and their reflections tremble across polished metal, carved surfaces, and the edges of folded garments. The church is warmer than the streets, though winter cold remains stored within the stone, beneath your hands. Outside, rain moves across Winchester, while inside, prayers and names gather around Cnut's resting place. Harold Harefoot became king in England in 1035 and ruled until 1040, taking the succession during a period of uncertainty. You watch the kingdom continue, not with the sudden sound of breaking glass, but through negotiations, claims, and gradual shifts in allegiance. Harold's rule carried the name of Cnut's dynasty, yet it could not reproduce the exact balance that Cnut had maintained. The English throne remained occupied, but the wider union across the northern seas had begun to fragment after Cnut's death. In Denmark, Harthacnut was king from 1035 until 1042, holding one part of the inheritance while the English succession remained contested. You imagine messengers traveling between courts, carrying seals, letters, and uncertain news across waters that had once belonged to one political design. Each journey takes time, and each delay allows local powers to act according to their own interests. The empire weakens through distance, not through one single catastrophe, as separate shores begin to follow separate futures. The evening settles over Winchester, and candlelight beside the stone tomb grows softer as the wax shortens within its holder. A faint draught moves beneath the church door, bringing the scent of wet leaves from the burial ground outside. The floor holds the chill of the earth, while woven cloth and polished would retain the warmth of hands and bodies. Dust rests in the corners of the chapel, disturbed only when a sleeve passes near the wall or a foot shifts across the flagstones. The flame nearest the tomb bends towards the stone, then straightens, its small glow repeating the movement of breath. Beyond the church, rain gathers in shallow depressions and reflects the dark shapes of trees without showing their branches clearly. The silence is never complete because water touches the roof, wind moves through cracks, and distant footsteps pass along the lane. A bell rope hangs motionless in the darkness, thick with age and slightly rough where many hands have pulled it. The tomb remains still beneath the changing light, holding a king whose political world has already begun to divide. In 1040, Harthacnut succeeded to the English throne, bringing another of Cnut's sons into direct rule over England. You see the succession as a continuation of the old dynasty, though the wider arrangement has become increasingly difficult to restore. Cnut was king of Denmark from 1035 until 1042, and his authority therefore reached across two kingdoms for a time. The connection between England and Denmark survived in his person, but Norway had already begun to move away from Danish rule. Norway regained independence from Danish rule after the collapse of Cnut's succession arrangements, following its own political direction. You trace the sea routes between the kingdoms, noticing how the same water that once joined them now separates their decisions. A ship can cross from one shore to another, but a ship alone cannot maintain a political union. Authority requires recognition, renewed through presence, reward, ceremony, and confidence that succession will remain orderly. Cnut had supplied those things through his own energy and reputation, but his sons inherited a structure whose personal center was gone. The North Sea Empire, therefore, did not disappear in one moment because its final shape dissolved gradually around competing claims. The sea lies dark beyond the harbor, and the last light has withdrawn from the surface, except for a narrow band near the horizon. You hear the distant wash traveling across the empty shore, sometimes clear and sometimes hidden beneath wind moving through the harbor ropes. Masts stand as black lines against the evening, their rigging making delicate patterns that vanish whenever mist thickens. A loose sail taps against a spar, giving a hollow note that repeats at uneven intervals above the water. The key stones are slick, and each step produces a small dull scrape as grit shifts beneath your soles. Tar, salt, and old would mingle in the air, while a faint trace of smoke drifts from houses beyond the warehouses. The harbor lamps grow brighter as the sky darkens, their reflections breaking apart whenever a wave touches the wall. Across the water, no royal standard remains visible, and the shore seems to belong only to night, tide, and weather. The routes endure, though the political design that once used them to bind kingdoms has lost its former coherence. Cnut's death in 1042 ended Cnut's direct male line in England, closing the succession that had followed the great king. You stand again within the English kingdom as Edward the Confessor becomes King of England in 1042. The change is significant, yet it arrives through familiar forms of royal succession, with oaths, ceremony, and recognition. Edward's accession marks the end of direct rule by Cnut's sons, though Cnut's influence continues within the memories and structures of the kingdom. The Anglo-Scandinavian political union was effectively gone by the middle of the 11th century. You do not see the union fall like a tower, but fade through the quiet separation of courts, armies, and obligations. Norway follows its own rulers, Denmark keeps its own interests, and England enters a new phase under Edward. The North Sea remains, yet no single king again holds England, Denmark, and Norway together in Cnut's manner. The empire's short life shows how heavily it depended upon Cnut's personal authority, and how difficult it was for his heirs to inherit that authority whole. Rain has ceased around the Winchester church, leaving the stones outside dark and shining beneath a clearing sky. Cold air rests among the graves, carrying the smell of wet grass, fallen leaves, and old masonry. The candles beside the stone tomb have burned low, and each flame stands within a small hollow of melted wax. Near the doorway, water drips from a cloak hung to dry, falling steadily into a shallow wooden bowl. The chapel roof holds the last traces of the storm, releasing them one by one into the quiet night. A pale opening appears among the clouds, revealing a few indistinct stars above the dark outline of the church. The stone beside you is cold enough to draw warmth from your palm, its surface worn smooth by time and reverence. The air inside carries a layered trace of smoke, wax, rain, and the earth beneath the floor. Beyond the walls, the distant wash of the sea continues, faint but persistent, although the coast lies many miles away. Cnut's memory remains near that water, even when his body rests at Winchester and his empire has followed separate shores. You consider what remained after the political union had gone, beginning with the methods by which Cnut had made power appear legitimate. Military conquest remained part of his story, joined by Christian kingship, dynastic marriage, law, patronage, and careful burial. You find that legacy in royal churches, written histories, family connections, and the continued imagination of a king who ruled across water. The later Tide story belongs to that imagination, giving memorable shape to a broader truth about kingship. It says that Cnut possessed great authority, while also showing that his authority was never absolute. The story is not securely attested in contemporary accounts of Cnut's reign, and its surviving form belongs to a later generation. Henry of Huntingdon's 12th century account therefore speaks as much about medieval ideas of kingship as about the historical Cnut. You allow both layers to remain together, the remembered king and the literary lesson, without forcing them into a single explanation. Moonlight settles over the harbor, turning the wet sand into a muted field of silver and charcoal. Small waves fold over the shore, their thin edges shining briefly before dissolving into darker water. The wooden chair has been carried away, leaving only 4 shallow impressions where its legs rested near the tide line. Foam slips into those hollows, fills them, and erases them with such gentleness that the change is almost invisible. The beach smells of salt and weed, with a colder note arriving from the open water beyond the harbor mouth. Clouds move slowly across the moon, and the brightness of the sea changes without altering its steady rhythm. A strand of rope lies coiled upon a post, rough against the skin and damp from the evening mist. Farther inland, a few windows glow between dark roofs, each one containing a small human warmth against the wide night. The harbor is nearly empty, yet the tide continues to rise and fall beside the silent timbers. The distant wash of the sea remains as the last sound between the kingdoms. You return to Cnut's reign through the routes that once carried soldiers, merchants, priests, envoys, and royal instructions. Those routes did not vanish when the empire fragmented, because commerce and pilgrimage continued beyond the life of the dynasty. What changed was the political meaning of the water, which no longer formed one continuous field of royal authority. The sea became again a meeting place between separate kingdoms, rather than the central corridor of one expansive rule. You can imagine Denmark at one end of the route, Norway along the northern reaches, and England facing westward beneath changing skies. Each kingdom carried traces of the former union, including memories of Cnut's victories and institutions strengthened during his reign. The union had been brief, but brevity does not prevent importance, and the short life of the empire left a long historical shadow. The descendants of Cnut did not preserve his arrangement, yet later generations continued to measure northern kingship against the scale of his achievement. His story remained available whenever writers wished to consider conquest, conversion, family, legitimacy, ambition, and restraint. Dawn begins again over the shore, with a thin grey light gathering behind the clouds above the northern water. The tide has withdrawn, exposing broad stretches of sand patterned with shallow channels and tiny ridges. A few shells lie open beside the waterline, their interiors holding droplets that catch the earliest light. Wind moves across the empty beach and presses the damp surface into a smooth skin that reflects the sky. The old harbor is quiet, though a gull walks along the edge of the foam and pauses beside a piece of driftwood. The smell of salt is clean and sharp, softened by the scent of grass from the dunes behind you. Far off, a vessel appears as a dark mark, traveling slowly along the horizon without any visible banner. Its wake is too distant to hear, but you can see the narrow brightness it leaves upon the water. The shore receives the wavelets, the footprints, and the falling light, keeping each for a little while before smoothing them away. Morning continues across the sea, indifferent to the names of kings, yet carrying the memory of every shore it touches.